This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to this morning's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee. Can we start off with apologies for absence?
Thank you, Deputy Chair. We have apologies for absence today from Assembly Member McCartney and Assembly Member Rogers, and Assembly Member Ahmed's here as a substitute for Assembly Member McCartney, and Assembly Member Moemma's joining us online today.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can I welcome everyone for joining us today, members, officers and the public, and we're expecting a school group to be joining us later on, and I'll introduce them when they arrive. And can I just remind everyone to make sure their electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode rather than vibrate mode, and maybe move them away from the microphones as they can be picked up on our system, please. And microphones, please make sure they're moved closely to you. Do not pick up by the microphone neck. Use the base to move it so that they work clearly. Right, let's go on to declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2, and does any other member have any other interest to declare? Noted? No? Lovely. Thank you very much. Summary list of actions. Item 3. Can we note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee? Lovely. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our main item, which is the first of a two-part investigation looking at outer London transport, which feels a very topical subject to be looking at today. So let me welcome our guests. We have Seb Dance, the Deputy Mayor for Transport. Welcome, Seb. We have Geoff Hobbs. Sorry, this is my eyesight. Geoff Hobbs, dear old friend, Director of Public Transport Service Planning at TfL. Welcome. Geoff. Alex Smith, Head of Campaigns at London TravelWatch. Welcome. Josh Cottell, Head of Research for Centre for London. Councillor Barry Lewis, Chair of the Environment and Sustainable Transport Committee at London Borough of Sutton. Welcome. It's really great to have a borough here today. And also next to you, Neil Stubbings, Executive Director for Place at the London Borough of Havering. Welcome as well. It's really important we hear the borough's voices in all of this. And Madeleine Stewart, Policy and Public Affairs Lead for Transport for All. Welcome all of you. We're delighted to have you here today. I'm going to kick off with the first question, and I'm going to ask Seb and Geoff for a TfL point of view. From your point of view, what is distinctive about outer London in terms of transport needs and provision compared to inner London and also places outside the capital?
I'm going to defer at some point to Geoff's vastly superior technical knowledge than mine, but if I can give a kind of overview, if you like. So obviously, we have a situation where the radial routes in and out of London to key town centres in outer London are pretty well established. These routes are based on historical travel patterns that need to connect town centres to the city centre, and in many respects, that's the kind of model that we've had for a very long time. But it's clearly the case that in outer London you have a less dense network than you would find in central and inner London, network being obviously access to a variety of different modes. And there tends to be more reliance on the bus than, for example, the tube. And of course it depends. Outer London is a very broad definition for a wide variety of very different places. Some will be well served by the national rail network, others less so. And I think one of the things going forward that I think will be increasingly important, particularly when you look at the ways in which people are travelling now, still travelling in and out of central London, of course, in large numbers, but also increasingly moving between town centres in outer London, some of which are actually well connected by various methods, but others clearly there is scope for looking at ways of better connecting them, which of course is one of the genesis of the Superloop, which aims to connect outer London town centres. Of course, it's important to remember that in a city this size, it's always going to be much more of a challenge to provide the kind of density that you would want anywhere, really, not just in London. And we shouldn't forget that we're quite lucky in London in having the variety of different travel options that we have, which are not available in many other parts of the country. But we should remember that the challenge in providing a density of network across such a large area, and recognise the fact that we have, for example, the largest bus fleet in Europe, second in the world only to Shanghai. Correct me if I'm wrong, Geoff, but I think that's right. And making sure that every Londoner finds themselves within easy reach of that network is a key objective. 96% of all Londoners live within 400 metres of a bus stop, is that correct?
96.5.
96.5.
Wow.
So it's not 100, so recognise the 3.5% who need to be brought within that figure, but it is a substantial achievement. And it's thanks, in part, well, largely, to the planning and work that people like Geoff do. May I defer to Geoff?
If there's anything you would like to add to that.
Yeah, sure. So, sorts of things which Outer London has in common might include things such as trends in usage of late, rather faster recovery post-COVID, for example. Having said that, use of sustainable modes as opposed to cars tends to be rather lower, 20 percentage points or thereabouts. It has almost uniformly higher car ownership. And there are all sorts of tactical things which flow on from some of these things. So, for example, there's rather less active travel, rather less bus priority. There is slightly less access to the public transport network. The 96.5% is an average, but it's a bit lower in Outer London, a bit higher in Inner and Central London. We've got all that borough by borough. It's also worth just saying that there are as many differences between Outer London and its boroughs than there are between Inner and Outer. So that same 20 percentage point in difference in sustainable mode share, that same 20 percentage points is the difference between some of the highest sustainable mode shares in places like Brent and Waltham Forest, and some of the lowest in places like Bexley, for example. Obviously, the rail provision varies markedly. Underground is much thinner on the ground in Outer London than Central, at the risk of the obvious. National Rail, similarly, but a different geographic spread as well. So that's another something that's not common across the Outer London boroughs, and all sorts of differences in terms of how various tactical policy inputs are put into, but things like controlled parking zones and how active travel is promoted and so on and so forth. So lots of similarities between Outer London, but quite a lot of differences as well.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And you mentioned you had some data there per borough. I think that might be useful for us to receive, if possible, please, to help us with this work. Let me come to the boroughs now. So Barry and Neil, thank you again for coming in today. How does public transport connectivity vary across sort of Outer London, including connections outside London? How do your boroughs compare to counterparts in terms of transport provision? Barry, do you want to go first?
Thank you. And can I just comment on the first question that was asked, the differences between Inner and Outer London? I think the main difference is that Outer London, and I am looking at Sutton in particular, but has been ignored. So capital investment, we've seen the DLR, we've seen the Jubilee line, we've seen the Elizabeth line. We've seen lots of capital investment on Inner London transport infrastructure. We come to somewhere like Sutton, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not dissimilar in somewhere like Havering. The last big chunk of transport infrastructure was Sutton Bus Garage, 1923. Happy birthday, Sutton Bus Garage, but that was 100 years ago. So that's the real difference. And some figures have been bandied about, but we're familiar with the £72 that is spent on public transport infrastructure per head in Sutton compared to the £3,000 odd that is spent in somewhere like Kensington, Chelsea, and that is the issue. That's a real problem. If the mayor, if TfL want to be serious about improving outer London transport, we need to start thinking about significant projects that we can work on. In Sutton, this could potentially include the tram, which has been promised but then frequently ignored. It could, for example, include more metroisation on the trains. We have this issue that in somewhere like Sutton, we've got, certain times we've got 2 trains per hour going into central London. We need more frequency. And the bottom line is, and this is perhaps answering your current question, this is why people will use their cars, because if they use the train, they will have to wait 15, 20 minutes. It's not like inner London, where if you go onto a tube train or go onto a tube station and, normally it says 2 minutes to the next train. If it says 8 minutes, there's a riot, isn't there? That doesn't happen in Sutton. We know we might have to wait 20 plus minutes for the train. I think I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's sort of given an indication.
The investment, that the offer that's currently available is the challenge.
It's the infrastructure, and it's them building up. And just one more point. I mean, and Geoff knows I love the 213 bus, and that has been reduced by 1 bus an hour. So it's making a significant difference. And I know Geoff will give justifications as to why it's been reduced, and in some respects some of them are valid, but it really sends a very, very bad message. And you do have issues, and yesterday I was talking to a resident who had to wait 20 minutes for the bus. It's just not on. One last point, interestingly, if you go back, so I've lived in Sutton all my life, and I was looking, I thought the buses used to be more frequent in the old days. And I used to get the 213 bus to school. The only data I could find was in 1959, which it was before I went to school. I went to school in the 70s.
Just to clarify that.
But just to give you an idea, frequency, Monday to Friday, every 5 to 10 minutes, Saturday every 4 to 6 minutes, Sunday every 5 to 8 minutes.
Yeah.
We've gone backwards, and that's why we're using the cars in outer London, because there is no alternative.
Yeah. Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Neil, would you like to give us a flavour from Havering?
Thank you very much. I think it's very similar to what Barry's just been talking about. In Havering, we would absolutely say we've been forgotten when it comes to public transport. We've seen reductions in buses, even where we've been told they're expansions, because actually the overall number of buses that are running to a certain destination has actually decreased. There's a few statistics that you could use. You say, what is the difference between various boroughs? Well, Havering, like Sutton, we're a big London borough, very, very big, probably the 2nd or 3rd largest. You can get up to 7 inner London boroughs into the area of Havering. Those 7 London boroughs would have 121 tube and rail stations. We have 9. You cannot get around in Havering if you want to go north-south. And I absolutely understand that 96% of all Londoners may be within 400 yards of a bus stop, but does that bus go where you want to go to? And that's the big problem. If you live in Harold Hill and you need to go to a job down in Raynham, you have to change buses about 3 times, and you have to leave the borough. It's hopeless. I can get from where I live in Buckinghamshire to Havering in less time than people can get from north to south in Havering on public transport. So why wouldn't they use their cars? The other issue, of course, is that people do have family and support networks out in Essex. We need to be looking at more sort of corridors and regional solutions to transport, because otherwise Havering will continue to feel forgotten with lack of investment. And I know we're going to get onto the Superloop later on.
Yes, we will, yeah.
But talking about connecting centres with the Superloop, Romford is one of the busiest outer London centre. Doesn't go near us.
Yeah.
We have no Superloop in Havering. And that's just an example of why Havering feels it's been forgotten.
Lovely. That's really helpful and important to flag those links to Essex and those outer boroughs. We will come on to the Superloop later and discuss that thoroughly. Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you very much. Well, continuing on the theme, I'm interested in talking about car dependency, and I'm going to start with Alex, if that's all right. Alex from TravelWatch, who we've commissioned to do some work looking at these kinds of issues. I know when I asked last year people whether they felt forced to own a car, and we deliberately used that question. We used YouGov, and we deliberately used that word forced to see if people really would agree with it or not. It's a strong word. 24% of people in outer London said they did feel forced to own a car. So can I ask you, Alex, what are the implications of this level of car dependency for people, and low public transport connectivity for people's lives in outer London that you've uncovered?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So as you mentioned, people in outer London do have to rely on cars, or feel they have to rely on cars more often, and I think part of that is due to, as been discussed, they do have fewer transport options. I mean, again, obviously there are variations between boroughs, which probably should be taken into account, but I think just the ability for people to get around, move around freely and affordable is so important to every aspect of people's lives, whether that's for work, caring needs, leisure, seeing family and friends, health appointments. It just feeds into everything. So if people kind of feel they only have one option, which might also not be an easy option for everyone, for example, if you're older and you might not necessarily be able to be at a point where you can still drive, or if you are disabled in a way that prevents you from driving, again, it kind of just really limits not only your way to get around, but all the other aspects of your life. So we think it's really important that people do have genuine alternatives. So that's not just, does a service run here, but also, is it a reliable service? Is it an affordable service? So kind of looking at it more holistically, because, it might be great if, as you say, if there is a bus that runs, but if it doesn't take you where you need to go, or you can't afford it, or it just doesn't turn up, that's not something that you can use, or you can plan your life around. So I think it is definitely a concern. Obviously, there are reasons that people may need to drive or use a private vehicle. I think, as been mentioned, for example, if you've got a family and you need to have cars, or again, if you are disabled and that is the easiest option or the best option for you, not all modes of transport are accessible to everyone. So again, that might be an alternative. But again, people who maybe don't necessarily want to drive, if they don't have another option, they have to. But if we do give them another option and they might, not be on the road, that also frees up the road for people who do need it. So yeah, a bit of a long answer, but basically I think it is a concern, and it does have very big impact.
Great. We'll drill into some more of those issues in a bit. Can I just raise the question of public transport accessibility levels, PTALs? Because in your report you do, so that's a broad measure of the accessibility of public transport, and it's quite an old methodology, and I think in your report you do sort of criticise the methodology a little bit, saying, for example, there's an arbitrary cut-off distance, so if a bus stop is 1 metre further than the cut-off distance, it may as well not exist. You also mentioned that it doesn't take into account the accessibility of there might be a railway station that is lots of services but not accessible to people. The other thing I'd add to that is that PTALs don't take account of what you can reach with how you can change. So if there's a bus that will take you in 5 minutes to a station, that station still may as well not exist according to the PTAL methodology. Would you agree with that? And would you suggest anything else might change if they were to review the methodology?
Yes, I mean, I should say I do think it is a useful indicator. As you say, there are definitely flaws, but it's a starting point. It does give you a rough idea of what access to public transport is in that area. But again, so I think the accessibility is a really big point. It might be great if there are all these options, but if you can't access any of those options, then you may as well have nothing. So whether that is maybe sort of different ones for different demographics or groups, I think that would be useful to address. And then maybe a gradated sort of review. So obviously a bus stop or a station further away isn't necessarily as useful, particularly depending on how you get there. If you're less mobile, for example, it might be harder to get there versus someone who can move around very easily and very quickly. But it does seem a bit extreme to have just a complete cut-off. I think, you know, as you say, you could be just an extra few feet away from something and it just completely lowers your score. I think also potentially looking at the reliability of those services. So again, we have, you know, in theory, you get a bus every 6 to 8 minutes, or you get a train every 10 minutes. But if in practice half of those trains are cancelled, or if they're always late or delayed, again, it's not really reflecting the true value. I mean, sort of the logistics and sort of the data entry side of that, I will leave to someone who's more specialised in that. But I think if there are ways to capture those aspects of travel, that would give a more robust and probably useful measure.
Thank you very much. Over now to Madeleine from Transport for All. We've just talked a little bit there about some of the issues being faced by disabled people. Would you like to go into more detail about Outer London particularly, and the lack of services and options?
Yes, thank you. I will do my best. Quite a large topic. I think a lot of the issues that disabled people in particular face in Outer London, they do come down to the frequency or infrequency of transport. So obviously all London buses are fitted with the mechanical ramps now, the automatic ramps, that's great. But if your bus is only coming, you know, every 20 minutes as opposed to every 5 minutes in an inner London borough, if somebody's already in that priority space and you are a wheelchair user or you have an assistance dog or you need that priority space, if somebody else is already in it, you are then waiting for the next bus and, you know, somebody else might be in it again. Like you're then waiting 20, 40 minutes, an hour, whereas you might not necessarily need to do that in inner London. And I think the reliance on the buses in outer London just kind of compounds that problem. You know, the lack of tube stations, overground stations, that is a real issue as well, but due to the fact that there are just more bus services and that is generally what people use, that, yeah, as I say, compounds the issue. Buses are also the most accessible and cheapest form of transport, so yeah, there's a lot of issues there. And I think just kind of coming back to Alex's point about car usage, again, the lack of frequency does mean that often it is quicker, sometimes even cheaper to use your car, and your car is going to be accessible. A lot of people have cars that have been adapted through the Motability scheme. It suits their needs perfectly. Public transport isn't necessarily always the most accessible, particularly if you are having to travel some distance to get to your bus stop or your train station. So you will end up having to use your car more often. So yes, so there is the kind of reliance on car usage, but I wouldn't want to say that people should stop using their cars, because again, a lot of cars are fitted for people's access needs, and they do mean that people's impairment effects aren't worsened by getting on a cramped service or having to do multiple interchanges, things like that. There are quite a lot of things I think I could say about this, but I do think that the main issue is the frequency. It is having to wait and not knowing if you are able to get on the next service because somebody else might be in the priority space. There's also the issue of tracking apps as well, like Citymapper. They are often quite unreliable. If a bus service is cancelled and that doesn't show up on the app, that does mean then, you know, disabled people do often have to plan their journeys in quite significant detail, more so often than non-disabled people. And if you are relying on your app and the bus or the train doesn't show up, you don't know when the next one's coming. It is quite anxiety-inducing, particularly because you're often having to give quite a lot more time to your journey, because you don't know what the access barriers that you're going to face that day will be. So I will stop there, but yeah.
No, that's really, obviously we'll have more questions later on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's move on to Assembly Member Moema, who's going to ask questions remotely.
Thank you, and good morning to the panel. My first few questions are to Geoff. So just building on what we've briefly discussed around PTALs, TfL assesses transport connectivity using 3 measurements. So in addition to PTAL, I think you also have travel time mapping and catchment analysis. And can you give us a brief explanation of what they are and the pros and cons of each method, please?
Okay, so PTALs first. So they're a summary stat, if you like, for each local area, which can be measured in sort of mere hundreds of square metres, fairly small, sort of 10 by 10, that sort of thing, or slightly bigger, of transport access, which is made up of various factors, so some of which are the distance from the stop or the station, the service levels at that stop or the station, and it takes account of the service levels at various different times of day. So that's the first one. But it does have lots of advantages in terms of it's quite a nice simple number. It's between 1 and 6. It's very useful for giving a round number in terms of the level of service that you've got in a given part of London, down to very local levels indeed. It's very granular. It's quite useful for planning purposes, quite useful for town and country planning, never mind transport planning. It does have lots of disadvantages in the sense that some of the ones that you mentioned to the group already. It's quite crude in many respects. It is very much a summary statistic, and hence there are lots of others which we can draw upon. So the other one in that same TfL website, WebCat it's called on the site, is travel time. So you can put in a given postcode or area, and the website will calculate travel time to a particular other location in London. And that's a much more well-rounded measure, but it's less summarial in form because you can go from lots of places to lots of other places. So that takes into account the fact that there are lots of different methods of transport, both bus and rail, and you can tab on it to go on one or other or both. So it's a much more well-rounded measure. There are many others as well. For example, the access measure, which I mentioned earlier. So how many residents are within 400 metres, for example, and that's the 96.5% for London as a whole. For Havering and Sutton, it's just over 90% as it happens. There are other boroughs which are above the 96.5%, hence the average. There are scores of others as well. You can look at all sorts of data about the volume of service in different parts of London, of bus service. Obviously, you can, as TravelWatch have provided lots of data on terms of the numbers of stations. You can look at also the level of occupancy of buses across different parts of London as well. And that's reasonably interesting insofar as it is fairly uniform across the whole of London, regardless of which borough you happen to be in. Namely, the usage of buses, the level of usage in Havering, as opposed to Westminster or the City of London, is pretty much the same across the whole of London. And that's by design. We try to make sure that we provide a level of service that matches usage levels wherever that might be. And also, we do our best to try and maximise access as well, in terms of that 96.5%. Not always possible, always and everywhere, patently, but we do try to keep it high. So that's a few of the measures that we use to measure access.
And so just briefly, so then the catchment analysis, is that the same or similar to any of the ones that you've outlined?
So we can use catchment analysis to look at journey times in the way that I described earlier, but we can also look at, for any given stop or for any given station, how many people live within a certain distance. It's usually 400 metres is the convention for buses usually 800 metres for railways, and you can see what the access is like. And from that individual analysis, you can get to the overall statistics of my 96.5, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. So then using that analysis, catchment analysis, TfL have said that in Outer London there will be a 43% increase in the number of Londoners within 15 minutes, 50 that is, of a job in 2026 compared to 2016. So what TfL projects have helped to bring about this increase?
So the biggest single one there would be Elizabeth Line. So obviously that's had a very major impact on boroughs such as Havering, for which it goes through the town centres, including Romford. There have been a range of line upgrades as well, of which, say, Thameslink programme, which is a national rail scheme, not ours, of course, is one such, affected to beneficially Sutton in that particular example, such that Sutton has direct access to quite a large number of central London terminals: Victoria, London Bridge, Farringdon, Blackfriars, St Pancras, etc. Then there have also been upgrades to other parts of the underground network. So over the course of the last decade or so, that upgrade has extended to Victoria Line, Jubilee, Northern, for example. Now, the upgrades themselves have sometimes been before 2016, but the timetable enhancements which have followed have post-dated that. Because one doesn't want to jump to conclusions straight away on at the end of a project, and you step up in parts to reduce the risk of things going wrong. And then there have been various bus enhancements as well. So we always change the bus network. There means some enhancements, some degradations. 213 has been a reduction, but the 127, also in London Borough of Sutton, has been an enhancement of one bus an hour. So it nets out in your borough. Sorry, I had to get that in.
One's on one side, one's on the other.
But overtaking the enhancements, which are relevant to this question, I think there's been 12 new routes and about 40 extensions over the course of the period since 2016. And then there's also been timetable enhancements of a lesser nature on Docklands Light Railway and some of the other modes as well. But the single biggest element of that is Elizabeth Line. Hope that helps.
So do you have any plans to update the analysis then, the way in which you kind of outline that, particularly focused on buses, I think, given what the boroughs have said?
We haven't got any immediate plans to update that. The investment plans have been more or less delivered or are being delivered as planned. There's still more forthcoming. So by which I mean, for example, the 4 lines modernisation, for example, on London Underground. That's a work in progress. We've done about half, but the relevant timetable improvements follow its completion, which is expected in the next couple of years. So don't think that the analysis will have changed materially such that we particularly need to update it just at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And then if I can move on to some questions for Josh and Seb. Do other cities in the UK provide better transport services to their outer suburbs, and are there opportunities that London should be exploiting? Start with Josh, please, and move to Seb.
Hey, thank you. That is a good question, and one to which I'm afraid I'm not going to have a very good answer. The study that we recently completed looking at transport in outer London, we did look at some case studies where in other cities they've introduced other measures, but I think the main thing that I'd focus on is that, as we heard earlier, the level of availability of, say, public transport or cycling or other modes of active travel like walking do seem to be lower in outer London, but still higher than in many places in the rest of England. So one stat that we haven't heard yet, I'll just add one, I'm sure there'll be many more as we go throughout the day, is from the 2021 census levels of car ownership. And so we know in outer London that there are about 70% of households own a car, and that compares to in inner London where it's about 40%. But that makes Outer London much more similar to the rest of England, where it's about 77%. And there I would just highlight that within that 70% of households who own a car, there are going to be many who, for the reasons we heard earlier from Alex and others, are going to need to continue using their car, whether it's because they're a district nurse and they drive for their job or for other reasons, such as the accessibility reasons we heard earlier and the difficulties of using various modes of other transport. But within that 30% of households that don't have access to a car, and I'm sure there are many more people living in the households which do have access to a car that aren't able to use it, perhaps because it's being used for most of the day for work or other reasons, there are going to be many people who are reliant on those alternatives, on the public transport, on active travel, and so on. And I think that was the impetus for our research, and where I hope to add some more value later. But I'm sorry to have effectively dodged your question here, and I'll hand over to Seb in case you want to add anything.
Thanks, Josh. I don't think you dodged the question, but I'll leave Seb to judge that, but I don't think you did.
And Seb, also if there's any international examples you might be able to bring
absolutely.
as well.
My vast international experience. I mean, Josh, you made the point brilliantly that of course, there is a higher dependency on car use in Outer London than there is in Inner London, and the statistics on car ownership are very clear. But still, Outer London, there are fewer people who own cars than there are generally in the rest of the country, and I think that is an important point to remember, that the level, the service of alternatives in Outer London is better than it is in the vast majority of the rest of the country, excepting, of course, some examples of inner cities in other parts of the country. That is a very important point to recognise. I would make a plea, if we could, and I understand because transport is one of those very emotive subjects that we all have a view on, and rightly so. But it's not correct to use terms like forgotten, particularly in the context of the Elizabeth line and the enormous benefits that has brought, not just to boroughs like Havering, but to recognise the fact that it has significantly increased the alternatives to car options for people, particularly travelling from one side of the city to the other. So we know that 30% of journeys on the Elizabeth line are new journeys on public transport, not just on other networks that the Elizabeth line has attracted, but they have been generated, they're new journeys on public transport. So one can only presume that they used to be car journeys, and the most obvious route that has been replaced by the Elizabeth line in terms of car journeys would be from one side of the M25 to the other. So clearly the Elizabeth line is delivering in spades, and already 1 in 6 journeys on the entire national rail network takes place on that one line. And that's a very strong argument that I put out there for other potential projects that I know are very difficult for Treasury and government to consider, but we should at least think about safeguarding the routes in order that they become a possibility later on. Other cities in the UK are going to be facing the same changes in travel patterns that we're seeing in London, of course, and it is the case that we would want the level of investment that the government is beginning to announce for some other parts of the country to improve their public transport networks. We would ask that London also receives the investment that it needs. It's something of a misnomer, I think, to call financial settlements for other parts of the country London-style financial arrangements, when in fact London is not receiving investment that it needs to further increase, building on the increases that Geoff has talked about. In other parts of the world, particularly thinking about Europe and the city I perhaps know best, other than London being Brussels, there is an enormous shift taking place in mindset arising from a variety of different policy changes that have aimed to correct some pretty big mistakes that were made in the past. For example, company car use was a key part of reward packages for companies in Brussels, where it was used to offset tax. The resulting chaos, I can say with some confidence, having lived there on the roads, the shift is now towards public and active transport, and actually Brussels is starting to transform in the way that many parts of central London and parts of Paris and other cities are transforming, which is very much to move away from car dependency and to provide the alternatives. But it's right to point out the deficiencies in the network. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. Of course we should, but we should also recognise that there is a significant challenge in expanding the network that arises from a lack of commitment from government to fund the networks that we need, and that what we have managed to achieve over the last few years is extraordinary, and there has been a marked improvement. And Madeleine is right, by the way, to point out the extra difficulties that people with disabilities face when it comes to the additional challenges of planning and the time that is required. But that is one of the key metrics that the Mayor is using to reduce the amount of time that disabled people need to plan their journeys, and we're on course to reduce that by 50% by 2041. We've already reduced it by 40%. It's not enough, I recognise that, but I want to make it very clear that that is a key part of the way in which we plan the public transport network.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, Geoff, if you have any views on that question, and just also to think about in addition to things like the Elizabeth line and the tube network, obviously Outer London relies much more on buses and some parts on trams. Just if there are opportunities that London could be and should be exploiting.
So, like you say, there's all sorts of existing transport.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, I just wanted to also add a plug for the overground as well, which is we haven't really mentioned in any detail so far.
Yes, I was going to mention that. You took the words right out of my mouth as it happens. So London Overground, that obviously the bigger part of the investment has been a little while ago, sort of in the period up to 2012, though we extended it to Barking Riverside in the fairly recent past. But that has been an immense benefit to a large number of orbital journeys, and it's not quite a comparable statistic, but if you go back to the old days, 2007, that was 33 million journeys, now it's 200 million or something near offer. But in addition to that, obviously you've got tram network, Docklands Light Railway, and an immense number of orbital bus routes, which will be augmented by the 6 new Superloop routes in the fairly near future. There are many things we could do to improve that as well. So 2 examples, there are lots more, but the West London Orbital is an idea that we've been promoting and been developing, which would be an extension of the London Overground through parts of West London between Brent Cross and Brentford, through Old Oak Common. As it happens, it goes through all sorts of London Plan opportunity areas, to lapse into jargon. And also the DLR extension, Thamesmead, is a second one. Both of which, both those projects really worthwhile. Both of which would immensely improve accessibility in those parts of the world, and to what is already a pretty good offer, in my opinion. Perhaps I would say that, but would improve in those next to the woods in particular. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you all. And then I have another question for Josh. Why did Centre for London recommend that Outer London needed a specific strategy and approach for transport? And what would this add?
Thank you. So, yes, as part of our recent research looking at travel in Outer London, we made a number of recommendations, one of which is that the Mayor of London introduce an Outer London transport strategy. It may, the same thing could be delivered by just increasing details to the existing transport strategy that relates specifically to Outer London. But to give you a sense of the kinds of things we were thinking could be added here, we set out in the report that the Outer London transport strategy could consider proposals for more frequent services for some kinds of journeys, such as we've heard already about the importance of journeys taken for things other than commuting, so for leisure, for visiting the GP, for going to the shops and so on. These kinds of services, these kinds of journeys in some parts of Outer London tend to be less well served than journeys into and out of central London. And so a greater focus on those kinds of journeys could be beneficial to many Outer Londoners. And in particular, one group of Londoners is women who tend to take on primary caring responsibilities and therefore to benefit less from the existing emphasis on commuting journeys into and out of central London. The second would be committing funding to the active travel and public transport offer in Outer London. Obviously, there is already commitment along these lines within the existing strategy, but more of these and more reflecting the changes in travel patterns that we see since the coronavirus pandemic. And finally, committing to specific interventions to improve connections among areas within Outer London, and also, as we've heard, the importance of the connections between Outer London and the wider South East, and how to enable people who are travelling not just towards the centre of the city but elsewhere too, and thinking about the specific demographics of Outer London. So Outer London's population looks different to that of Inner London. There tend to be more families with young children and more elderly residents and fewer people in the kind of middle age bands, and so a greater emphasis on providing services which suit the needs of those people.
Okay, thank you. Before I hand back, Chegg, I just wanted to ask a cheeky follow-up to Geoff on that. So Assemblymember Baker and I have had various conversations over the last 12, 18 months with TfL about the issue that Josh has just raised around the who is making the journeys. I wonder if there's any move to better understand not just the length or the time of journeys, but who are the people making the journeys, and kind of refining the interventions that TfL makes when you're making decisions about investment.
So we know an awful lot these days about the numbers of trips, where they're going to and from, and one can also tell from ticket type data a certain amount about age and mobility. So freedom passes tell you something about the types of trips, or who's making them rather, as do zip cards. It's much harder to get into the journey purpose data. I mean, I'd quite like if everyone was quizzed on going through a gate to ask, well, why are you making your journey? But it's obviously a tricky thing to do. Now, what we have tried to do is to use computer techniques to see if one can derive what the journeys are. And one can do that because if you are going from suburb to city and stay around 8 hours, then it's quite likely to be a commuting journey. Not 100% sure, but you're quite likely to. And then you can see other patterns. It's easy if you're on a zip card and you're travelling on a school day on a Monday morning. You can probably work it out for education kind of thing. But there's always quite a bit of fluffiness. You certainly wouldn't be able to get down to the level of detail of whether you're going to the doctors or the pharmacy or visiting friends and relatives or shopping and so on and so forth. The other source of data that we do have on things like journey purposes is from our surveys such as customer satisfaction, which is one of the ways in which we keep tabs on whether the degree to which customers feel strongly or otherwise about our transport services. And as part of that, we do ask the nature of the journey and why they're travelling. That's obviously only a sample, so it's much, much smaller than the sorts of big data sets we get in for origins and destinations. But it gives us quite a good straw in the wind, and it was very, very useful over the course of the COVID years, where journey purpose became all of a sudden very, very important about whether it was an essential journey or not. So we got some insights into it.
Okay.
Does that help?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the next section, Neil, you'd briefly indicated you wanted to just come in.
Chair, thank you very much. And I just wanted to come back on the impact of the Elizabeth line on Havering. And I certainly don't want to fall out with Geoff and Seb, because it's really important that we have a good relationship and partnership together. But for Havering, it didn't mean we got any new stations. It didn't bring people closer to public transport. What we did, we got some renewed ticket offices, and we got some improved pavements outside, and we got the connections into London on the actual railway line itself, because it really was a rebranding of an existing line that we already had.
Okay.
And we got the new trains, of course.
Okay, well, we'll pick that up. We've got a whole section on trains, so hold your thought there, Geoff, because I'm trying to keep us to time. Let's move on. We're going to look at in detail at different sections, different modes of transport. Oh, I am so sorry. Sincere apologies, colleagues. I was so looking at trying to get through, because we're well over on this section. Okay, you're right. I had Neil and Marina wanting to come in on this. I am so sorry. Assembly. Yes, please, thank you.
Morning, everyone. Just a quick preamble, actually. So Councillor Lewis and I don't always see eye to eye on everything, but I would endorse every single word that he said earlier, and it's delightful to have someone else in this chamber making exactly the same points that I normally bore everyone about how Sutton is the forgotten borough. And it certainly feels that way there, despite what it might feel like from Palestra. I wanted to pick up, though, on the point that Assemblymember Momo was making, Geoff, about sort of mapping, PTAL, all that stuff. One of the issues that I run into a lot is about even if the PTAL is sort of medium, let's say, the actual journey times from that place to somewhere else may be very different because of the density of the net, where you have to go in a direction to go back in a different direction to get to where you actually want to go to. So I wondered whether with sort of modern computer technology you can create something like, say, custom isochrone maps, so you can put a point and go, where are the points you can get to in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour from that point. Does TfL producing a paper map like that obviously is not practical, but do you do computer modelling like that, so you can actually see from this point where are the places you can get to? And in particular, this is my plea, that we then use that as a way to think about changes happening in public transport, where you can then open up new places that people can get to more conveniently than now, because it seems to me that should be a big goal of anything that we do.
So the short answer is yes. So if you go onto the software, it's called WebCat. If you put WebCat into Google, you'll find it. And then you can there's a tab, you can either look at PTALs or you can look at just that kind of thing. So you can put in a postcode, for example, and it will draw you a map, colour-coded map, with a variant of what you just sent just then.
Well, this sounds brilliant. Thank you, Geoff. And then just a quick question, if I can, for Seb. I know between 2010 and 2016, TfL published sub-regional transport plans, and obviously since 2016 hasn't done that for Outer London. What's the thinking behind not doing that, and why is, perhaps you're going to tell me why what you do now is better?
The honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But if you'll allow me, I can follow up with you on the sub-regional plans, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps Geoff knows.
I can help at least a bit, and it's not my specialised topic. But so the reasons were, you can regard them as good or bad reasons, but the Mayor's transport strategy is 300 pages long as it is. We did do those 5, as you say, sub-regional transport plans. They didn't actually say an awful lot more in those sub-regional transport plans than what was already in the base Mayor's transport strategy. But they did take really quite a lot of time and energy and to keep up to date, nonetheless. So for those reasons, we went for the rather longer Mayor's transport strategy and no sub-regionals. Also on the basis that we are quite long on strategy, my assessment, no one else's personal judgment, and rather than having things geographically, would do things more thematically instead. But there's some of the reasons.
Okay. And I suppose my point would be just to echo, not to labour the time, but the point that Neil was making earlier about, looking out to Essex, and obviously from where I am, looking down to Surrey and to some extent Kent. That's what the transport area looks like that I live in and that my residents live in. It's sort of, that central South London bit and out. And so, having TfL thinking about what transport looks like for people in that area seems to me to be valuable, rather than, thematically, what does cycling look like across the whole of London or something.
So we still do that through the local implementation plans, of course, upon which there's an awful lot of focus. And obviously, that's a means by which money changes hands as well. So that seems
But those are borough-based, aren't they?
They're borough-based, yeah. So they are smaller and more local, but they're also more focused, and because money changes hands, they're more pointed.
Fair enough. I suppose I would just concluding make the point that all wonderful though the London Borough of Sutton is, where I live, I do sometimes go to other places that are nearby. Yeah. And thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Let's go Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cottell, with your organisation recently released a report, Moving with the Times, supporting sustainable travel in Outer London, and the first recommendation was about providing sufficient funding. Could you say and tell us what more the level of funding government should be providing to TfL and the boroughs?
Thank you. Yes. So the way we phrase this question, this particular recommendation, is because we make a number of recommendations, 10 recommendations throughout the report about how you might improve the travel options available to people in Outer London. Lots of these are going to require money, and money is something that is very tight, as the panel will know, at present. And so we recommended 2 potential ways for more money to be made available. One is direct grant from UK government to improve the travel options available to those who are face the fewest travel options at the moment in Outer London. And the second is to grant the Mayor of London powers to raise more money in the capital to spend. And the kinds of things that this could be spent on, we make a number of recommendations, including some big ticket items, such as improving the reliability and frequency of the use of train network in South London, so maybe moving towards something like what we see in North London with and some parts of South London with the London Overground. That's a very big, expensive project. Others that we mention in the report include introducing new travel routes, so introducing new public transport routes when there are new developments, so say there's a big new housing development or office development, introducing from the beginning the fact that there's going to be, say, a bus going very close by there once it's finished, so that people who are moving in can be advertised it as somewhere which has got good public transport links, so they don't have to buy a car or bring a car with them in order to get around there. And we also talk about the active travel network, so for instance introducing cycle lanes. The map of the London Transport cycle network in London is again one of those quite radial routes, and so providing more local cycle lanes which are segregated so people feel safe cycling in them outside of the flow of traffic, and so they're not incentivized to cycle on the pavements as we hear is happening in some places, could improve the options available to people so they could cycle, say, from their house to a local train station or other hub. Those are some of the main ways that we thought that additional funding might be used.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor, TfL needs £475 million in the next financial year to go through with the projects that you were already committed to. What level of funding should the government be providing TfL every year?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and the 475 million refers to an identified shortfall in the amount of capital funding versus the amount that TfL believes it can generate. So I know members would have heard me say this a lot, but it's very important for context. The pandemic saw a 95% reduction in ridership at its greatest extent, which of course, when you have a network that relies more on fares than is the case with any other network around the world, most of whom have a much greater percentage of support from regional and national governments. That obviously necessitated the funding deal with government. Since then, TfL, through a series of very difficult decisions, not least on fares, which the Mayor had to make in the last round, and with some restructuring, some of which necessitated by the government in the funding deal, and we work closely with government to ensure that we meet the conditions that they have set. TfL is due to run a very small surplus on operational funding, but it can never generate enough for capital funding. There is no transport authority in the world that can do that independent of support from government, whether that be, as I say, regional or national. So on that basis, we really do ask that the government provide the capital funding that the city needs, and very well aware of the well-made arguments out there that London has received its fair share, but to point out that London is, of course, contributing to the National Exchequer, and it's right that the National Exchequer use its funds to support other parts of the country. We absolutely support that. But if we reduce the ability for London to deliver the transport system that it needs to deliver, then obviously we reduce the amount that London can contribute to the National Exchequer, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, we've had some very good discussions, including as recently as yesterday with government, and I'm pleased to say that we have a very positive relationship on an individual basis. But I appreciate there are very difficult decisions that government need to make. The economy is not in a great state, and I appreciate that the Treasury in particular has demands on it from various other departments as well. So this is not an easy ask for government, and I don't pretend that it's an easy ask for government, but what I do say is that we should look beyond the spreadsheet of money in, money out, and look at the value that the public transport system provides, which greatly exceeds the money that is put into it, and that is the thinking that I would urge government to use going forward.
Deputy Mayor, thank you, Chair. My very last question. You quite rightly outlined the issue that TfL faced during the pandemic when everyone did the right thing, and of course ticket sales went down, were non-existent, and what that meant was that the TfL was in the crisis that you've described, and TfL is the only major transport authority in the world, as you know, that does not receive an operating grant from London, despite the fact that London actually generates 23% of the GDP of this country. Do you think that operating grant and how the funding for TfL happens should be reassessed by government? Should this change?
I think it should certainly be a consideration that government looks at going forward. When you have a system that is uniquely dependent on fare revenue, there is an argument that when revenue is healthy and people are travelling a lot, and by the way, I'm pleased to say that the level of ridership is increasing. It's not yet where it was pre-pandemic, although on occasion it is and exceeds it, particularly at the weekends, but only on occasion. Overall, it's still below where we were pre-pandemic. But you have to understand the importance of resilience to external factors. So the 2008 financial crisis was the previous shock to TfL's finances. I don't have the exact figures, but the pandemic dwarfed the impact of the 2008 economic crisis. But both of those show the importance of resilience and the need to have a system in place that combats that resilience. One thing I would say is that the decisions that TfL have taken on service provision have been incredibly important in maintaining confidence and trust in the network when you compare it with some of the decisions that the train operating companies have had to make as a result of requirements from the DfT. Take, for example, the reduction that's been pointed out already in some services on the national rail network from 4 trains an hour to 2 trains an hour. That has a big impact on people's ability, trust and confidence in that service. I'm pleased to say that on the overground, no such reductions took place, even at a time when ridership was very low. And the result of that is that the trust and confidence of the travelling public has come back on the TfL network. And I think that that decision on its own speaks for itself.
Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you very much. Members, we are over 20 minutes behind, so I'm just flagging that for you there as we move forward. Right, the next section is on the private car, and Assemblymember Garrett's going to lead this.
Thank you, Chair. I should consider myself flagged. So if I could start with Seb and then Geoff and then Josh. So TfL and local authorities are looking to encourage people to move away from private cars. What are the challenges, specifically I suppose in outer London, where as we've talked about them, it's much more prevalent. What are the challenges, do you think, in doing that?
I also consider myself flagged, and I could probably talk at length, but I shall try and keep my comments as short as possible. So I think obviously we've discussed some of them, that the fewer number of alternatives compared to other parts of the city means that by default, if you like, the option of private car travel is going to become more attractive in that list of options. I think it's also very important that we've heard a number of times how some car journeys will always be necessary. And I think it's important, by the way, to recognise the importance of the car in the mix. It is an important part. Some of us will need to use a car. some of the time, and some people will need to use the car all of the time, and we have to recognise that. And I think one of the key aims we should have is to reduce the number of unnecessary car journeys that take place in order that the necessary car journeys can be made easier through reduced congestion. So the number of alternatives is one problem. The convenience of the car, perceived convenience of the car, but I think there is something deeper, to be perfectly honest, which runs through our culture about notions of freedom, and if you think about any sort of vision of the open road and the kind of romanticism of post-war Western freedom, the car has been a big part of that, and we can all understand why, but I think we need to think about the practicalities of moving several tons of metal, the size of the average family bathroom, around the city, that if we all did that, then obviously cities would grind to a halt, and there are numerous examples of how that's happened around the world. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we have a very, very deep cultural challenge to address, and it's all part of sustainable planning and fighting climate change and changing the way we think about the decisions we make when we choose the mode with which we travel. Now, part of our job is to make those decisions easier and to provide more alternatives. Absolutely accept that challenge, but I'd throw the challenge back on the individual as well, that we should start making those calculations when we decide on the mode of travel, and perhaps we're at the beginning of that journey.
So you've given two reasons there. One is that it's a more attractive option for some journeys than public transport, and I would definitely agree with that. And then also about the sort of culture of everything you were just talking about. Funny enough, when you said Western freedom, I was picturing a man on a horse, which we don't have so many of, actually, although we do have some Pegasus crossings in Sutton. Between those two, I think my colleagues are now debating whether horses are sustainable travel. I'll leave them to that. Active travel. I think they probably are active travel. Between those two, though, between the sort of the culture and then the sort of hard numbers of this journey would take 40 minutes by bus or 15 minutes by car, let's say, overall, which of those two factors do you think is sort of the bigger, or how, let's finger in the air percentage terms, how big a factor do you think each one is?
I mean, I couldn't possibly generalise. Each decision, each journey is obviously unique, but you're right. The convenience and time spent is obviously going to be a factor. But what I would say is that the impression of the car as being the quickest is not always the case, and we should work to ensure that it is rarely the case.
Okay, Geoff.
Just to add that we have done some sorts of analysis around this, where you sort of take the sort of trips and the sort of people, and you can place them on something of a spectrum, if you like, or continuum, about how likely one is able, taking all factors into account from fares to service levels to mobility to everything else, how likely it is possible to switch that trip from the car to public transport or active travel. The headline is about 20% of trips which are most likely to switch, taking those factors. But they're distributed in slightly curious ways. So all of outer London is not homogenous in this regard, and there are some places where it's much more plausible than others.
And in terms of sort of partly harking back to what I was talking about earlier with those sort of isochrone maps, how much of a factor is that in the planning of how you do service? And I'll give you a specific example. I was talking to some residents down in New Addington, and because of the focus on access, the TfL's idea was that, so New Addington is a sort of lozenge-shaped council estate at the bottom of Croydon. And because of the focus on access, there was a tendency to kind of snake the buses up and down and around. And there's really one main road that runs down through the middle where the tram also is. A number of residents were saying to me that the bus is essentially useless because you might as well walk 10 minutes up the road and catch the bus 20 minutes further along its journey, which to me seems completely rational. So how much, in terms of journey times versus access, it seems to me the journey time priority would be to try and feed people into that main road, whereas what TfL seem to like is an access route where you get a scenic tour of New Addington, which is perhaps lovely on a summer's day, but not always the fastest way to get to where you're going.
So absolutely, what you describe is a tension in that particular example, and obviously journey time matters, and so all the statistical relationships that we've done, we've worked out that if you reduce journey time by 10%, you get 6% more users. So it matters, absolutely. And hence, of course, that's one of the reasons behind Superloop, which is the branding name, of course, for what appeared in the Mayor's Transport Strategy back in 2018, if you look hard enough at the...
Yep. I think we're coming on to... I don't want to tread on the Superloop question as questions, but...
Sure, but yes, journey time absolutely matters.
Okay.
And journey, not just the scheduled journey time, but the reliability of that journey time as well.
Yeah, the variance in the time, as I would think of it. Yeah, okay. Josh?
So a lot has already been covered, and I'll just add the way that we've set this out in our thinking in our report was that there are three kinds of things that influence people's decisions about how they travel, and I think they've all been covered. The first is kind of people's capabilities and their needs. So, do they need step-free access in order to make a journey on public transport, for instance? What kinds of journeys are they needing to make? Then there's their attitudes or the kind of cultural factors, which are there and vary amongst people within Outer London and across the capital and the country. And the third one is the kind of travel environment. So as we've heard, the kind of frequency and reliability of the travel options available to you, their kind of convenience, and also their cost. And on convenience, it really varies, as we've heard, even within different parts of Outer London, how convenient it is to, say, use public transport or to cycle a journey. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves in terms of the Superloop, but thinking about the kind of north and south circular that you've got for driving a car, one of the people we interviewed for our project raised the thing that there's not a clear alternative to that in terms of public transport options at the moment, at least especially in South London. And so the thing that we suggest public policy focus on is the kind of that travel environment. How can we influence the travel environment in order to make it more appealing, so that those people who have kind of some attitudinal preference towards driving a car at the moment, but perhaps it's a relatively weak one, could be encouraged to use a public transport or other modes for more of their trips. And like Seb said, we're not looking at switching all trips, just only those unnecessary ones. And for some people who will still need to use a car for some of their trips, then perhaps car clubs, which if made relatively easily available close by and have lots of places where you can leave those car club cars, could be an attractive alternative for some people, which means they no longer have to own a private car, which can be quite an expensive endeavour in itself.
Yeah, this word necessary and its counterpart unnecessary comes up quite a lot. What's the definition of a necessary or an unnecessary journey? So if I take my kids this evening, which either I or my wife will be doing, to a club that they go to, there's no public transport, literally none, where the particular activity happens. Is that a necessary car journey or an unnecessary car journey? Should I pile them all onto bikes and make them cycle up the main road? Would that be better?
So yeah, I think there's always going to be some blurry lines between what's necessary and unnecessary. In that particular instance, I think we've got to talk about in the context of the current travel environment. So if there's no public transport option available, then perhaps that is, a necessary.
Well, it's not necessary that they go to this club, is it? I could just save some money and they could stay at home and watch TV.
Okay, well...
So is that necessary or unnecessary?
Yes, others may have different views. I like to think about necessary in terms of taking into account the kinds of trips that people will want to make, then which of those can they currently make using active travel or public transport, and which of those can't they and therefore have to take via driving a car.
So it's about the necessity of making the journey by car, not the necessity of making the journey at all?
Yes, I'm not talking about encouraging people to travel less, although that is a separate debate, and providing amenities close by, the term that's often used, but yeah, is 15-minute cities, providing local amenities so that people don't have to travel so far, which can obviously improve the amount of time they have available to do other things in their lives, as well as reducing the kind of emissions and congestion.
Yeah, I'm just conscious that I've been flagged already before I even started, and 15-minute cities is probably, I feel the flag being raised. If I can come now, thank you, Josh. Sorry, thank you. So if I can come now to Neil and Barry about, so from your point, we've touched on a bit on this already, but what's the role of the car in your boroughs in terms of sort of economic and social activity? Perhaps we'll start with you, Neil. What does the use of the car look like in your neck of the woods?
It's an interesting statistic in Havering that we've gleaned, that a typical household owns more cars than it has children. So over 3 vehicles they will own because of the lack of alternatives, because of the length of the journey, because of having to go further afield out to Essex, as we've spoken about. We also have a significant number of trade-type jobs in the borough. So we have the carpenters, the trades, that sort of thing. And we have a lot of care workers who travel through our borough from Essex and live in the borough as well. So those journeys are being carried out essentially for people to get to work or actually doing their jobs. So that is really, I believe, what is driving the use of cars in Havering.
Thank you, Neil. And actually, you made an interesting point about the sort of the commuters from out of London into outer London. So from Essex into the bordering bits of London. I know that's a big factor in, from people travelling from Surrey up into Sutton and Croydon and so on as well.
And that is particularly prevalent in care workers in the borough. We have in East London we have an older population. We have a lot of care workers, a lot of care homes, and a lot of other supported housing as well.
Thanks, Neil. Barry.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Seb mentioned, or somebody mentioned, the attitude, the culture, and sometimes, and not only Sutton, probably everywhere, there is a default mode of, I've got to go somewhere, I'm going to hop in the car. And it's difficult to change that. And I say personally, I've been able to change that. And I looked at my Google travel stats for last year. I'm very proud of these. I cycled with my e-bike 2,008 miles. Public transport was 963 miles. Walking was 209. And my car use was 2,000 miles. So my car use was marginally less than my cycling use. So it is doable. You can change it. But Neil, you're quite right. If you have children and you've got clubs to get to, there's no public transport. If you want them to go to those clubs, how do you get them there? Perhaps a number of years ago, it was safe once they were 10, 11, you could set them to walk. But there's those concerns that people won't allow their children to walk because they're worried about them being knocked over by the cars, so they drive, adding to the problem. And it's fully understandable. And, there is also the issue, public transport is a problem in Sutton and, Bromley as well. I was talking to the lead member in Bromley about this, Nicholas. And it's a large area. If you want to get from A to B, it's too far to walk. There isn't a bus. You can't get there. You use the car, because otherwise you won't be able to live your life in the way that we're used to living our lives in the 21st century. Yeah,
effectively it limits what people, it sort of shrinks people's horizons, really, as I was talking about earlier with Geoff about how far you can get to in certain places, that the colours change to whatever the bad colour is, and lots of places become harder to get to.
But I will say that it is possible, and I think that's where perhaps a lot of work has to be done to change people's attitudes, to make them think about, actually, I don't have to fall out of my house. And that's the problem, actually. Even if I'm using my bike, I've got to go down to the shed, get the bike out of the shed, walk out the garden, and what have you. The car is parked out front, go. The keys are by the door, off you go. And that's the problem. It's too easy. And we do need to work out how we can change people's attitudes.
Do you know what, Barry? You've read the next question on my sheet, which is, what are you doing? I'll go to you first, and then to Neil. About what are you doing as a borough to sort of tackle some of those issues that we've just described?
So I think as a borough, we are trying to make, that's the other issue, is obviously safety. So we're looking at how we can make roads safer for people doing active travel, walking and cycling. So where we can, looking to bring in the 20 mile per hour limits, which I know is encouraged by the Mayor, looking to provide school streets so that it's safer for children, for example, to walk to school rather than mum or dad or carer driving them to school. And again, I think we know if we could take a significant amount of the school traffic off the road and onto the bus or onto the cycle or onto the Shanks's pony, then you would reduce that unnecessary, I think that's a word, the unnecessary car use.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Neil, what's happening in Havering?
I think probably very similar. We're trying to encourage residents to make those lifestyle choices, linking it in with health and well-being, trying to get people to get out of the car, and hopefully encourage rather than force. That's what we need to do, and it's very clear that the feedback we get from residents is, well, help us make the streets a bit safer for us, try and enable us to be able to cycle safely. Because when I talk to cyclists in Havering, well, actually there's not that many to talk to, because you take your life in your hands if you're going to cycle around Havering, and that's the feedback that we get. The problem that we have in terms of putting in safer routes for cyclists is the infrastructure, the road infrastructure, doesn't really lend itself to that, because, and it's a bit of the problem is created by the car, because a lot of our streets have got car parking on the curbs. You need to get the cars off of the curbs to be able to put the cycle routes in, because the streets are so narrow. But where do they go? So trying to deal with these things, it does need a whole systems approach that we're trying to adopt and encourage rather than force.
It's an interesting point, actually, that I have occasionally got on my hobby horse about, that an environmental, and I use that word in inverted commas, measure in planning policy, I mean like town and country type planning, is to remove off-street parking. What that does there, if the people then don't have good alternatives to the car, is they park their car on the road, and you effectively then box out your option to put any kind of cycling space or even just a wide lovely pavement, because there are cars there. And as a green measure, we've made it harder to remove the cars from there. I don't know whether that's something you've looked at in Havering.
I think we probably have, and we're trying to, as I said, we're trying to work with residents to make sure that they do have those opportunities, and we're looking at the bigger opportunities to make livable neighbourhoods, to change the way the road network is designed. But I think, as has already been said, it all takes money, and it's really difficult to be able to fund it, particularly at these times at the moment. 2 of our livable neighbourhood schemes were part funded by TfL, and of course TfL have got the financial problems like all of us at the moment. So it does create a problem for us. We also do deliver the planning requirement for bicycle storage within homes that we build, but they're just not used that much. And that is another problem that we find, and to some degree it's almost derision created by the number of cycle spaces that we provide compared to the number of car parking spaces that are provided, because it's just seen to be totally inequitable.
Yeah, but presumably the theory with providing the cycle spaces is that the infrastructure is slowly over time sort of accumulating, but it just sits there with cobwebs on, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Or residents ask for the cycle storage to be turned into car parking storage.
Yes, no, I can see that. So, I mean, in a funny way, then that possibly brings us back to Barry's point right at the very beginning, that as a borough, you're sort of dependent on TfL or somebody providing better public transport alternatives, rather than, you know, that you're sort of limited in what you can do in terms of road space and so on. If the bus network, it doesn't provide an attractive alternative, if there's no tube or tram or what have you, then and that's not within your gift to really provide.
That is another story, that one is how we do look to fund, and whether or not we should in future be linking more investment for public transport to growth, economic growth and housing growth, which is probably, hopefully we might get the opportunity to come onto that subject later on. But yeah, we are reliant, and I would hope that within Havering we are creating a much better relationship with colleagues in TfL and GLA, and we do work well with them at the moment. But sometimes the problems that we find are potentially in central government as well, and their lack of ability to understand and to join up all these strategic requirements.
You're hinting there at this sort of problem of, say, Havering out to Essex, which obviously when it goes into Essex stops being TfL's problem to some extent.
To some degree that, but yes, absolutely, yeah. Okay.
In that case, if I can finish then by asking Madeleine, what priorities do TfL and local authorities need to think about, in terms of different groups of Londoners? Particularly, you spoke earlier about disabled people and how, what the choice looks like in terms of switching probably looks quite different.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So I think something that hasn't really been spoken about much yet is the concept of multimodal journeys. So we know that a lot of disabled people will take their car or, try to take their car to their local train station, but there's a lack of parking, and particularly blue badge parking as well. There's been kind of real-term cuts in the level of blue badge spaces. The number of disabled people in this country does keep growing. It's just kind of risen in the latest census data to, I think, from about 20% to about 24% of people in this country are self-identified as disabled people, but blue badge spaces haven't gone up. So I think thinking in terms of maybe people take their car for a 5 or 10 minute journey to the train station, or like another local transport area, and then they use public transport, that's really something to think about. So that's still reducing car journeys, but it's just reducing the length of them really, and potential congestion on the roads as well. And I think another thing that we should really be thinking about, particularly in outer London, is investment in door-to-door community transport, such as Dial-A-Ride, and I know that Wandsworth being inner London, but it does have its own community transport scheme, and Assembly Member Pigeon very kindly wrote a foreword for Transport for All and Age UK London's report on the Dial-A-Ride service. I think investment in those kinds of door-to-door transport links would really be helpful, beneficial in getting cars off the road, but still allowing disabled people who need that door-to-door transport, who can't make those kinds of active travel or public transport journeys otherwise, allows people to make those journeys. And I know that we're coming on to active travel later in the session, but there needs to really be more investment and more looking at kind of pavement quality and walking and wheeling routes and cycling routes, because the quality of pavements really does have a massive impact on whether people are able to walk or wheel to a bus stop, to a train station, to the shops even. If the pavement is bumpy, if the slabs are broken, if there are tree roots coming up, if the level of tactile paving on pavement corners going into the roads, if that's not there, people will use their cars. They will be car passengers, because it's not safe and it's not feasible to make those journeys otherwise. So yeah, kind of three-pronged approach there, I think.
Thanks. Yesterday when I left here, I walked up to Canning Town. There's a really brilliant example there of a really beautiful, wide, smooth pavement that ends in a sort of obstacle course of poles and no drop curb. So if anybody makes that journey, I'd be delighted to know how they think somebody with a pushchair or on a wheelchair could make that journey, because it's not easy at all. Just on this point, Seb, just to finish off, Madeline's brought up this point about railheading, driving to a railway station or a tube station and then getting a train in. Mayor's not a big fan of that, is he? I know he said we have a housing crisis, we don't have a car parking crisis, and he's not a fan of railway stations' car parks. How does that sort of, how do you think about this mitigation of what Madeline's talking about, for some people that actually does allow them to make a journey partly by public transport that would otherwise they perhaps just have to drive?
I mean, the distinction there is between the use of what are quite large bits of real estate for general parking versus the need to ensure that there are adequate spaces for disabled people. And we should ensure that where spaces are removed for the provision of housing, that they are replaced for disabled people, but that there is not the level of general parking that could be better used for housing or other real estate that would deliver on other objectives. I mean, affordability of housing being an obvious one, fighting climate change through a variety of different measures as well that could be could put that land to better use. But where there is a removal of disabled parking, then that should be replaced. So it's not about removing disabled parking spaces at all.
But for people making that, sorry, go on, Geoff.
Just a bit of an anecdote. Once upon a time, I did a planning inquiry to expand the car park at Hatton Cross, and it was a bit of a tricky time for me insofar as the evidence came out that a lot of the trips that would newly go to Hatton Cross car park at the end of the Piccadilly line to make onward journeys into central London would actually be car journeys from longer distances, Slough, Reading, even Bristol, thus encouraging car trips rather than going to their local station. So you can have all sorts of perverse outcomes from a park and ride policy. So you have to be very careful about it, is my takeaway.
Yeah, park and ride wasn't really one of our topics, so I'll perhaps leave that there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I did see Barry you wanted to come back in.
Sorry, Barry. That's right. Just a very brief comment on what Madeleine said about door-to-door services. So many of you are aware that prior to the pandemic, Sutton and Ealing had the on-demand bus trial, which was expensive, I acknowledge, but it was also starting to become very, very successful. And I think that's something we should consider, because though there is a cost involved, arguably it's perhaps an alternative to thinking about car clubs and stuff like that, which also cost money. But at the end of its trial, sort of 50% of users were paying users, so it was travelling in the right direction. And it does provide that door-to-door, not only for disabled residents, but also normally abled residents as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. It was a very interesting trial, and hopefully we might see something like that come back. Right, I have got a number of members who want to come in. So, Assembly Member Boff.
Didn't realise was next. Sorry. I was fascinated, Mr. Dance, by your comments about Western freedom. Looking forward to you typing that up into a treatise called Against Liberty, Seb Dance. I really am looking forward to that. Who is the best person, Mr. Dance, to determine whether or not a journey is unnecessary?
I'm not against liberty. I'm making the point that actually some of the concepts, I'm clearly not, concepts of, as I said, moving several tons of metal the size of the average family bathroom around is not necessarily liberty. But so you won't be seeing that treatise from me anytime soon. The best person is the individual, of course. And as I said, there's kind of two sides to this. The first is to provide the greatest number of alternatives and the convenience that is possible within the constraints that we have. And the flip side is that the individual needs to have the facts and figures at their disposal in order to make that decision. But of course, it's up to each and every one of us to decide how we travel from place to place.
And do you, I mean, your policy is just to make it difficult for people to drive, isn't it? Well,
no, not at all. As I said earlier, if you remove the car journeys that could be undertaken by other means, then you actually make it easier for drivers who need to drive. We've had numerous examples of journeys that would have to be undertaken by car. And to use Neil's example earlier, it would be a brilliant thing if that journey could be undertaken by bike on the main road without fear of personal safety, with cars that were travelling at 20 miles an hour rather than 30 miles an hour, and knowing that the risk of collision and injury is much less. And that, of course, is at the heart of the Vision Zero strategy that we have to reduce the number of injuries and deaths on our roads to zero. So it's not about being anti-car at all. It is about ensuring that those necessary car journeys, the journeys that have to be undertaken by car, are indeed made very much easier by the reduction in congestion.
You're saying that, but the London plan says we should discourage people from using their cars.
But that's part and parcel of making the necessary journeys easier. If you discourage the journeys that could be undertaken through other means, and, yes, accept the challenge, provide more alternatives, then you make those necessary journeys very much easier. So it's not against car at all.
It would be great if that were the way round, that we got the public transport improvements before we got to the rather authoritarian tactics that are currently being employed against car drivers.
I think we've heard numerous examples of how the public transport network since 2016 has been significantly enhanced. We've heard about the Elizabeth line, we've heard about the extensions to the tube network, we've heard about the line upgrades that have taken place, we've heard about the upgrades to the bus network and the changes that have been made to increase the frequencies to and from town centres. We know that the Superloop is coming in.
All those things we know about. We know about the improvements.
London tram system.
We know about the improvements, but those improvements should have been enable people to make decisions about whether or not their journey is unnecessary, rather than, as I say, becoming quite authoritarian against those people who need to use cars.
I'd suggest that the increasing figures of people using public and active transport across the city suggests that people are indeed making that choice.
And do you think that, for instance, disabled parking provision and car club provision should more of that should be provided?
Yes, I do. And I think it's very important that boroughs recognise the role that they can play in this, because it's very difficult for TfL, that has control of only 5% of the roads, to enable a parking strategy that sees a significant increase in bays, for example, for car clubs. There's a number of different approaches around the world. Some cities, and thinking of Dublin in particular, use an area-based approach when it comes to car clubs, and you can see the obvious examples in that, benefits in that you don't need specific bays. The trouble being, of course, that when you introduce zero-emission vehicles, you don't have the necessary charging infrastructure for those vehicles. So there's pros and cons in different approaches, but boroughs clearly need to think about their strategy.
Sell me car clubs. I think they're a great idea, and also what I think is a great idea is parking for disabled people, allocated to disabled people. So how is it that in the London plan, those two groups, car clubs and those people who need to use disabled people who need to use a vehicle, have to compete against the maximum parking provision on any new development, rather than having additional spaces to that maximum?
Again, the aim of the London plan is not to introduce that competition between different groups who need the parking.
It may not be the aim, but it's the result.
Well, and again, I'd say that the boroughs need to think very clearly about the strategies that they have for providing space for both car clubs and disabled residents, because, as you say, those are two groups. In reference to disabled drivers who need the spaces, and in terms of car clubs, it's a clear and obvious way of reducing our dependency on personal private car use.
So if you were allowed to provide disabled parking spaces and car club spaces in additional to the maximum, that surely would bring about an expansion of those that usage. Well, or the car club usage and the ability for disabled people to park.
Well, you can't create additional space, as you quite rightly say. So the corollary of that needs to be that there's fewer spaces for private cars.
And so there is a competition between the two?
Not between disabled spaces and car club spaces.
No, not between those. I'm saying there's a competition between disabled spaces and car club spaces. And when a new development comes along, all the demands that there are from a new development, I've lived this. I live on Barking Riverside. All those new developments that come on, their parking requirements are competing against disabled and the car club. And if you just allow additional spaces, surely you would have more provision for both car clubs and disabled. And I'm coming to an end.
Right, I mean, Barking Riverside is a good example where there's obviously been a new public transport link in the extension of the overground, which very much reduces the need for people in Barking Riverside to have a private car, therefore reduces the number of private parking spaces that are needed.
I'll finish, but and yet, if you go to the residents' meeting, which is why I don't go to the residents' meetings anymore, is the only thing that's being discussed is the lack of car parking in that area, from serious requirements for car parking.
Sure.
Okay. Let's leave that. I think you've made the point there clearly, and planning policy does have a role here, but we're not the planning committee, but it does completely have a role here. I understand that. Okay. Assembly Member Berry wants to come in. Assembly Member Berry will come in. I will then defer the question I was going to ask to later on, and we will have a comfort break.
Mine is hopefully very fast, Chair. I think it's a question to Seb, possibly also Geoff. It's about the MTS, the Mayor's Transport Strategy target on mode share. I'm very interested in some of the things that Madeline was saying about multimodal trips and integrating different modes together. And I'll have further questions on that later. But in terms of your overall target, that is a target for journeys and trips as a whole. And I wanted to just first of all check, is that broken down by journey stage or not? Is it the main mode that you're targeting with the 80% active, sustainable travel mode share that you're aiming for by 2041, I think?
I think Geoff has a specific answer, but just to say on the 80%, that is about all public and active transport modes. So absolutely recognising Madeline's point that most journeys are multimodal. I mean, you have to get to a particular node or station or whatever it be in order to transfer, absolutely. So most journeys are multimodal.
So I think it's a main mode trip, but I can get back to you with the exact definition of the mode share number.
That'd be really great. And then when you were consulting on the original mass transport strategy, my group and others asked for a breakdown of that overall target by inner and outer London to make it more useful and a better measure that you could track. And this was done. Page 305 of the final strategy does have a different set of mode shares for inner and outer London, also for trips between inner and outer and between outer and outside of London. It's a very much more useful set of targets there. However, your documents that give the updates on delivering the strategy literally have one line for the target, for progress towards the target. And I was just wondering, basically, when you're reporting back on progress, could you report back on progress in that more granular way? Because there's plenty of room on that chart for extra lines.
Don't see why not, because I know we collect it.
Great, thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, we're going to have a comfort break now, and we will return at 11:50. Correct, so we're going to start back, and our next section is looking at rail, really important for huge parts of Outer London, and Assembly Member Baker is going to kick off.
Thanks, Chair. Stole my thunder there. I was going to say how important it is to such massive areas of Outer London. And so I wanted to ask, firstly, Alex from London TravelWatch and the boroughs, Neil and Barry from the boroughs, what has been the scale of cuts to national rail train services in Outer London, and what do you think the impact has been on residents? Alex and then Boris.
Yep, thank you. So as you've alluded to, national rail services since the pandemic have been cut quite significantly. So I think across England and Wales, I think it's about 15%. Looking specifically into London, so I don't have specific kind of holistic data in terms of the exact numbers that have been cut in Outer London, but looking at the TOCs or the train companies that specifically operate a lot of those services out of London, we're looking at similar cuts. So, for example, Govia, Thameslink, Borough, who do Southern, Thameslink, sort of those areas, Southeastern, Southwestern Rail, you're looking at cuts across their networks as a whole between 13.5% to about 19%. So there's a really significant cuts. So I should say those are passenger train kilometres. Obviously, that is alongside a fall in passengers travelling as well, but that has recovered not completely, but quite a lot since the pandemic. Whereas those sort of passenger train numbers are staying lower than they were pre-pandemic. What that actually means on the ground, so it's not uncommon to see stations that before the pandemic had 4 trains per hour, for example. Take Cllr, now has 2 trains per hour, which does really kind of, I think, reduce the attractiveness of using that service, both because obviously it's less frequent, it's less of a turn up and go service, but also it can mean that those trains are more crowded. If you look at loading data, both from train companies themselves, but also anecdotally, and we've also had people get in touch with us with concerns about crowding, reliability of those services. So train companies have obviously, finances are tight after the pandemic, given the fall in revenue. So they're kind of arguing that this is matching services to demand. But again, that overcrowding at peak times, I should say, this is less of an issue at other times, is suggesting that maybe that has gone too far. And we'd ask them to maybe look again and try and build back those services where they can. Also in other areas, so for example, Southeastern had quite a significant timetable change in December, which we did have a lot of people get in touch with us concerned about the scale of those cuts. So again, it's potentially having less trains per hour and those sorts of issues again, but also changing the terminal stations that people can go to. In fairness, Southeastern, they have added a few services back in to address things. But so, for example, they did cut the Sidcup to Woolwich loop, or Abbey Wood loop, which obviously does have an impact for people trying to get there, but also reduces the connectivity of the system. So, for example, people would want to travel from Bexley, around that sort of area, or Sidcup, to join the Elizabeth line in that area. And with that line being cut off, that's no longer an option for them. So the benefits of the Elizabeth line for people in those areas aren't as great. So it kind of has an impact on other parts of the network as well, or the connectiveness for people. So yeah, the cuts have been quite significant. And again, it's almost a bit of a worry in terms of, is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? If you make it less attractive because the services aren't as frequent or they're crowded, more people have discretion about whether they, for example, go into the office, if they can work from home. If their journey into the office is expensive and not very comfortable, will they just choose to stay at home? And again, further sort of reducing passenger numbers. So I think that is a concern from our side as well.
Thank you. I'll come over to the boroughs for a second. I just wanted to say, is that automatically worse in Outer London because of the fact that there are less options, just less connectivity overall? Is there anything you'd like to say specifically about Outer London?
Yes, very good point. I think, as we mentioned earlier, some boroughs in Outer London, they don't have access to the overground or the underground, so they do have to use National Rail services more. So again, any changes there will have more of an impact. I should say there are a few cases where there have been slight improvements. So, for example, at Alexandra Palace, trains from King's Cross to Cambridge now stop there, so they have had a slight increase. So it is, again, a mixed picture across boroughs and across different areas. But yes, again, because of that reliance, I think people in Outer London are actually slightly more likely to use National Rail services than people in Inner London, which again just shows how it's such an important service for those areas. So again, those cuts are likely to have more an impact in these areas.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Barry, Neil?
Thank you. So starting with the positive, and Geoff mentioned as well about the Thameslink service. It is wonderful now. You can go straight into London. Previously, when you went into London, you got to Victoria or wherever, and you then had to go underground. Now you're sort of riding above London. It's good, but the negative on that is still only 2 trains an hour. For the rest of the services, it really is death by 1,000 cuts. We've lost off-peak services from Sutton, Carshalton up to Victoria, up to central London. The trains on the London Bridge line have reduced in size during off-peak times. And arguably there's some logical reasons for that, but it doesn't send out the right message to users because they just think, oh, it's gone down, and they look for alternatives. And it's part of the compact almost that residents who live in Outer London have, that they should have regular solid services into our city, and when those are being taken away from them, they will. As you said, sorry, they will stop using them, and they will work from home, so they won't start using them in town. So, and it is. I was going to say with Sutton, we've got no overground or underground, and it almost sounds like a Womble song, doesn't it? But
I was trying not to say that, but I thought it was disrespectful. But since you've said it, it's okay.
Wombling free. There may be reasons why financial reasons why the train service companies are saying, oh, we can't afford to run these trains. We need to reduce the size of the carriages, the size of the trains to save money. But it gives the wrong message, and it makes people think there's not an interest in providing good, decent, safe public transport to London. The other thing, just with the cuts, so with Sutton, we've got the money for the Levelling Up Fund, which will mean that between Sutton and Belmont, which is where, in fact, Councillor Garrett is... sorry, you're not here, are you? You're Assembly Member Garrett, sorry. Put the right hat on. But where the Cancer Hub is, which is going to be a massive centre for employment, employing up to 13,000 people and for research and everything, we will now be able to have 4 trains an hour, hopefully, because there are some issues with the trains that will be servicing those 4 trains an hour. So that we probably will get 4 trains an hour. They're actually not going to be spread equally through the hour. So you'll have, 2, and then you might have to wait 20 minutes to the 3rd train and so on. So, it is. I'll go back to what I said first of all. It's a cliche, but it is death by 1,000 cuts.
Thank you. And you made comments earlier on about the need for metroisation, so that's really helpful. Thank you. Neil.
Thank you. I recognise what's been said and would echo mostly those thoughts. What we found within Havering is, yes, we have got the Elizabeth line, but what that has come along with at the same time is that we've lost our fast trains into Liverpool Street and so into Romford. I think it's the 3rd largest metropolitan centre in Outer London, but we don't have fast trains anymore. In peak hours, we get 1 or 2 a day now, whereas we used to have quite a regular service. So that's been seen as a loss. I would also absolutely support what Barry was saying about metroisation of the heavy rail. I don't know if we're going to have an opportunity to talk about this, but I would like to just identify the Bean Park Station situation that we have at the moment. Can I just talk about it?
Yeah, please.
Could you just move your microphone just slightly nearer?
Of course.
Is that okay?
I'll tell you what, I'll come forward as well.
Oh, yeah, just to catch it. Sorry, just yes. Now's the time to talk about that. Thank you.
Definitely.
Okay. We've got an hour, have we? So the Bean Park Station is a rather sorry state of affairs at the moment, where it's identified within the London plan. We have effectively got housing zone status. It's within an opportunity area. It's in the Thames Freeport. It would serve the forward tax zone. But unfortunately, we can't get sign-off from DFT for actually building the station. The problem that we have here is, and we're working really well with colleagues in the GLA, it's a fully funded station from the GLA and the developer. But unfortunately, and it's something that Seb mentioned earlier on, DFT are taking a very siloed approach to this. It's purely around commercial. Is there a guarantee of any losses on the line? Now, we believe we can show that there won't be losses on the line. That's the South Essex line, Essex Thames side. But they can't get their heads out of the spreadsheet and won't give it a sign-off for that station to be built. That facilitates the delivery of up to 10,000 homes. It takes our PTAL, whether you like the designation or not, from 0 in that area up to 3. Buses only get us up to 1.5. So there's in the region of 5,000 homes that can't be built in that area at the moment. And being in the Thames Freeport area, it's also a really important area for the delivery of economic growth in the borough and in the capital itself. What I mentioned earlier on about needing to look out into Essex as well is really important, because whilst the DFT and the train operators are saying that there will be delays on the line, you can't argue that there will be delays on the line of having a new station. If there were to be a strategic approach where you look at the whole line from Fenchurch Street out to the coast, you'd be able to invest in that line and make it quicker. You'd be able to have more trains an hour. You'd be able to have longer trains, and actually you could reduce the level or the time it takes to get into London. And whilst everybody nods when I talk about this, but nobody is able to say, well, let's have a strategic approach to this. Now, we don't need any money to put the station in place. It's fully funded. We've got a £10 million indemnity, but that's not big enough for DFT to sign the station off, and all the benefits that come with it. But the trouble is, I sound like a broken record, I'm sorry about this, people are sitting in an office looking at a spreadsheet making a decision rather than coming and walking the area, looking at the placemaking. And it's very much, again, I have to agree with Seb, we're not making decisions on where the value can come from transport and transport investment. We're just looking at a spreadsheet and saying it's going to cost too much. We can't have it. So that's the situation we got with Bean Park Station, and it would facilitate so much placemaking, jobs and homes if we could get it and people could just work strategically.
Thanks, and I think that was really both for that particular issue and illustrating that we seem to have decisions on rail being taken in very, as you say, siloed ways and really not working. And having been down to that area, been down to Bean Park, and I'm sure other AMs have as well, they should get down there and see. It's absolutely ridiculous.
What I don't understand is I've spoken to Homes England, I've spoken to Transport East, spoken to the GLA. We're all prepared to take a strategic approach and look at the entire line until you get to the DFT, where they say, let's just look at the economies of that station.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Thanks for making all those points. That's much appreciated. I want to ask a couple of questions about an issue that suddenly became very, very urgent last week in the area of rail, which is ticket office closures and the planned closures to, almost all ticket offices on the rail network, which obviously will significantly impact large areas of outer London. And I wonder whether I could ask Alex, because London TravelWatch obviously is going to be responding to these proposals in a very, very short space of time. I understand that you will be looking at various aspects, the ability to buy the tickets, the level of staff presence, and how that impacts on the services for disabled passengers. How are you going to be able to do that in such a short time? What approach are you taking, and do you have any thoughts about how that's going to specifically impact outer London at this early stage? Obviously, I know you're gathering information.
I guess starting with the last point around the impact on outer London, as we mentioned before, parts of outer London, sort of the public transport option is basically just the bus or National Rail. So changes to National Rail, for example, these potential ticket office closures, will likely have more of an impact. I mean, also looking at, for example, the TfL system, there is a zonal system, Oyster card, all sorts of things. But, there are other parts where that is not necessarily in place. The National Rail fare system is obviously quite different. So again, they'll sort of have different impacts. As you mentioned, so London TravelWatch has a formal role in this process. So we facilitate the consultation, which consists of 21 days for the public to respond. And then we have, as outlined in Schedule 17 of the Ticketing Settlement Agreement, which kind of governs this, we have 7 days to analyse this response. We are also given details of the proposals from train companies, so we'll also be looking at that. I should say we obviously cover sort of the London area, transport focus. We'll be doing this for the rest of the other parts of the country. So that is in theory meant to be 7 days. We haven't agreed a 28-day extension with train companies, given the scale of the proposals, so that we do have more time to go through that in depth. So as I mentioned, we'll have the detailed proposals that we're going through, but the public consultation is a really, really important part of this. So I'm going to do a quick plug to please respond or encourage people to respond. Can do it online, by free post, or by phone. And that will give us hopefully a really detailed information about, because I should say these are all technically separate consultations, so we'll be going station by station, ticket office by ticket office. So we very much encourage thoughts from people, both generally, but also if they've got local knowledge, if there's, for example, a hospital near a station, or if there's a station that has maybe a particular antisocial behaviour problem. Very, very welcome all of that information. And then we'll be using that and going through that. There's a team of us working on this. And as you mentioned, we're judging that against Department for Transport guidance. So basically, a major change to ticket office opening hours or closure can be made if it would be an improvement in terms of quality of service and or cost effectiveness, and if people have continued widespread and easy access to tickets. So we'll be looking at the really obvious: will people still be able to get the ticket that they need when they need it and in an easy way? Accessibility is obviously a really, really big part of this. So, for example, will passenger assistance be available, turn up and go? Will it have any impact on that? Wider facilities like waiting rooms and toilets. And then we'll also be looking at wider staffing arrangements at stations. We know ticket offices aren't just used to buy tickets, they're also a source of information. So looking at other kind of mitigations and stuff that train companies are suggesting putting in place. So we'll be reviewing all of that before we put our response out after this, which will basically be an object or no object. Train companies, if there is an objection, train companies then do have the opportunity to appeal to the Secretary of State. That will be the end of our part in the process. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Alex. Madeline, could I ask you, because I know Transport for All have views, and you've written to DFT to ask them to pause this on a number of grounds. Could you talk us through the reasons why you're objecting?
Yes, thank you, absolutely. So, as Alex has mentioned, we know that ticket offices are not only used for the sale of tickets. They provide an identifiable point of contact. They're used for information. They are incredibly useful to many different disabled people from different impairment groups. Just one example of this is that under current guide dog training, there is a command for the dog to find the ticket office in a station's main concourse, so that their handler can go to the ticket office and buy their ticket. They are not, in this case, many blind and visually impaired people are not able to use ticket vending machines. People with dexterity impairments are not able to push the buttons. Many wheelchair users can't reach the ticket vending machines. There's a figure kind of being bandied around government at the moment that 99% of ticket sales are or 99% of tickets are bought online or via TVMs. These do not include some ticket types, such as the 50% wheelchair discount that is only available to buy at a ticket office. That's kind of not even addressing the fact that 23% of disabled people are internet non-users. They do not have access or do not use the internet. Again, you need a person to help you buy that ticket. And it's not even just kind of buying the ticket, it's making sure that you are getting the ticket that is right and appropriate for you. So yeah, I mean, there's so much that I could say on the importance of ticket offices. I would encourage people to have a look at our campaign because we only have so much time here, which
Yes.
will give you more detail on the importance of ticket offices.
Thanks. I wonder whether this is something that because I could talk about this all day as well, and I shouldn't.
I was just going to say, I think given we've had a discussion, I've sort of flagged this with group leads, that we might want to, as a committee, look to respond on the issue of ticket office closures. We've got a couple of weeks to do that. So if we take that offline, and perhaps we can add a delegation to the end, so we can get that signed off in the next 2 weeks. Okay?
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you
raising
very
that.
much. Cheers.
Back to me completely. Okay, let's move on. We've got Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. Seb, just a quickie for you. Obviously, there's a general feeling that more rail services should be devolved to the Mayor of London, the suburban lines. Not everybody agrees with that, I hasten to add, but there is a general view. Part of that, of course, would be engaging with the county councils that surround London, because their people would be affected by that. Can you tell me, when is the last time that you or the Mayor have had a conversation with any of the leaders of those county councils to discuss the possibility of getting their support? Because I do understand that some of them are reluctant to give support because they feel they wouldn't have a political say in what happens to their services.
So the key person really is the Rail Minister, who I actually had a meeting with 2 days ago, no, I didn't, sorry, last week. I had a meeting with a different minister 2 days ago. I had a meeting with the Rail Minister last week, by the way, we raised Beam Park and invited him to attend. I think his personal commitment is there, but it's I paid credit to him, actually. He gave some warm words on it, but it's obviously an issue that he needs to work through with his department. So, you know, we need to talk to national government to work out what can be done cross-border, because it's been mentioned several times today already. The responsibilities, obviously, of any administration run up to the boundaries, but you have to recognise that people travel around and across those boundaries, and I think the point's been made well about the local travel areas of parts of Outer London, obviously including other parts, other county councils. I'm very happy to talk to county councils as necessary, but as I say, and by all means, if any council leader wishes to approach me or the mayor, that would not be a problem at all. But as I say, the discussions that I've had on integrating transport across the boundary have been with the Rail Minister in particular. On metroisation, I completely agree. One of the question marks at the moment is GBR and the government's intention on that. it's been a long time coming, and again, I've heard very reassuring words from the Minister himself that it is on track, as it were. Pardon, that's actually not an intentional pun. But we have to see what happens with that, because if it doesn't deliver the metroisation that everybody agrees we need, then rail devolution would seem to be an alternative proposal.
Just on that, I mean, that is a window of opportunity, surely, and if we could, or if you could get the county council leaders to lobby with you, the Minister, that's a window of opportunity that exists now, but that won't exist if and when the GBR thing is completely finished. So I just thought it would be sensible, surely, for you to have those conversations with the leaders of the county councils.
Oh, absolutely. I think any and every conversation on strategic matters like this is sensible. I don't think that the publication of the transport bill, as and when that happens, and I hope it happens in the King's speech, but again, we'll have to wait and see. I don't think that would be the end of the opportunity at all. In fact, I think knowing what the explicit proposals are that the government has would be the perfect opportunity to have those conversations.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I want to go on to talk about rail fares and fares more generally as well. So first of all, to Alex, who I know has looked at this for us, and then I'll move on to Josh. How do the differences in rail fares impact on the travel choices of outer London residents?
So as I slightly alluded to earlier, rail fares system can be very complex and confusing for passengers, which then obviously can have a knock-on impact on how likely they are to travel by it, in part because of cost. So for example, if they're not sure the right option for them, given the various tickets, and particularly, for example, if they're travelling, as we mentioned earlier, from outer London into, for example, Essex or Sussex or another part of the country, and don't have sort of the zonal fare system. And then obviously if that's more expensive, then it makes it a harder choice, and they might defer to, potentially, for example, if the car journey would be cheaper, it could impact that side of things. Sorry, slightly lost my train of thought. Could you repeat the?
Could you maybe comment on the zonal system as well? Because obviously a lot of people do use pay-as-you-go or Oyster and caps, and that's obviously different levels of payments for outer Londoners, not just to travel into London, but also to travel around outer London within the same zone. It costs more on a cap. So.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the zonal system, I think there's probably a few aspects to that. One, again, this is what I was going to say, apologies, is also making sure they're advertised fairly and clearly. So an issue that we've seen is on the National Rail Inquiry's website. If you put in your journey, it will show you the cheapest ticket that you can buy from them. But that might not necessarily be the cheapest option. So it might be cheaper to pay by Oyster or contactless, and that's not necessarily made clear. So we are working with them to improve that. But that can be a problem. But then similarly saying sort of you can use Oyster or contactless, some people can, but some people can't or find it harder. So I think there's about 250,000 people in London who don't have a bank account. So again, contactless isn't necessarily an option for them. People who prefer to pay by cash, as I think has been mentioned, people who are digitally excluded and find those sorts of payment systems harder. I know sometimes people will try and use a day travel card or a one-day travel card, which I believe TfL are kind of looking at the moment whether they withdraw, which I think we would be against, given again these are used by people in outer London or outside of London as well, for example, because you can pay for it by cash. So it's a simpler option. You can use it on the bus, you can use it across different modes. So I think all of those things sort of combine into how people travel. And again, we have heard people say, if this option isn't there, then maybe we won't be able to travel this way, or we just won't travel at all.
Sure, thank you. Maybe I'll move on to Josh, because I am interested in fare rates, particularly for people in outer London. Have you looked at that, and do you have any comments to give?
So I've got bad news and good news. The bad news is I personally have not looked at it. The good news is that my colleagues in Centre for London are releasing a second report on transport as part of our transport strategy next week.
Could you also move your microphone a bit closer?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
So my colleagues at Centre for London are releasing a report next week looking at the costs associated with different modes of transport in London and looking at, for different people taking different journeys, what are the costs of travelling via public transport, via driving, and what would a number of policies that you could introduce, from changes to road taxes to things like road user charging and changes to the fares associated with using the bus or underground or rail, how those would influence the costs that different people face. So I'd be glad to make sure that a copy of that report is shared with members next week.
So if that's coming out next week, you can't tell us anything about it right now, can you? Because it's all going to be embargoed and exclusive. And
yeah, I'm sure that I could get an embargoed copy to the members. In the next couple of days.
Excellent. So I'll move on to the Deputy Mayor on this issue, if that's all right. These fare structures, particularly if you're looking at, we are broadly migrating most people now onto pay-as-you-go or Oyster. And if you're using that, the concept of that is that you just travel around and you pay the fairest amount. But if you look at the sort of official rates for pay-as-you-go caps, they are much higher for journeys that take place between the outer zones or within the outer zones than within Zone 1. Zone 1, 2 or 3, in fact. So say a one-day cap, if you're just in zones 2 and 3, is £9.60. If you're in zones 4 to 6, it's £14.90. Now, you were talking earlier on about the different levels of car ownership and car use. Surely that strong price signal is contributing towards that and ought to be reconsidered. There seems to be a penalty simply for being in zone 6 and starting your journey, which doesn't seem fair.
So there's obviously pros and cons in every system, whether it's a zonal system or flat fare system. And I think there's obviously different factors that come into play. It's not just TfL's fares, it's also the fares set by National Rail and the train operators. So the fares are calculated on the basis of agreements that are made with other partners as well. The key advantage of a zonal system is that it allows much greater integration between the different modes, which you don't see in other cities. Take New York, for example, where the flat fare doesn't have an integrated element to the other modes. The concept really on the fares is that the further you travel, the more you pay. And the distances tend to be longer when travelling to Zone 6, for example, from Zone 1. But I take your point about the inter-zone travel. I've got the kind of table of fares here, and generally speaking, the peaked fares, the capped fares, tend to be comparable with other transport networks around the world, as opposed to the individual fares on 1 to Zone 1 to 6 journeys. And there is actually an element of it being cheaper than going into Zone 1 for many of the journeys. So it works both ways. It's not always necessarily more expensive to travel in the outer zones. I think Geoff wants to come in on some of the technicalities.
You've hit on the logic problem that we've got. If it's based on distance, then if you're just travelling within Zone 6 or between Zones 5 and 6, that's not as long a distance as going into the centre, and therefore ought to be cheaper.
So just to note that you'd have to be going at some to cap out, because, for example, the off-peak pay-as-you-go fare within Zone 6 would be £1.80. Within 5 and 6, two non-central zones would be £1.90. So the individual fares are far below the cap.
Sure, but we're talking about, so the example that Josh gave earlier on was like a district nurse who's travelling about all day, and those kinds of costs rack up, and there's definitely a price signal there, you must admit.
There's a price signal there, but you would have to make a lot of journeys to reach the cap.
Sure, but those kinds of people are the people who might drive then, aren't they?
They might do, but the impact on fares overall on behaviour is fairly modest. It's not zero. So a 10% increase in fares leads to a 3% reduction in usage. and obviously it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the number of people who make those sort of trip chains on the railways alone is very low indeed. The bus cap in Outer London, in fact everywhere, is £5.25.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I'm trying to go as quickly as I can. I could talk about this all day. Then just also on multimodal trips, obviously the hopper fare allows you to take, and this is for people who are taking one single journey, hopper fare allows you to take 2 buses, but there's no ability to change from a bus to a tube or train journey which is free. Is that something you're considering? Because again, this idea that you've got very, very few railway stations in Havering, people are catching buses to that train, and therefore they're paying extra.
It's something which we thought about in concept, but it's quite a hard thing to do for 2 reasons. Firstly, that it has to be gained. You have to gain agreement across all the parties to the pay-as-you-go agreement, which includes all the train operators and Department for Transport. And secondly, there was obviously a budgetary impact of doing that, so you'd have to make up that through a change to fares more generally.
I mean, that's another good reason to bring the train operating companies under our wing, isn't it? Then we wouldn't have that complexity. And then back to, thank you very much, unless there's anything else you want to add on that. Great. Back to Alex and Madeline, therefore, on the proposal to withdraw the day travel card. On Outer London residents and visitors who come in that way, what kind of impact is that going to have, and will you be responding to the consultation?
I'll go briefly because I've already touched upon this, and we'll pass over to Madeline. So we have responded to the consultation and had conversations with TfL about this. I think we're particularly concerned that it will have the most impact on lower income Londoners and also people travelling from outside of London. I mentioned the digitally excluded, but also looking at, for example, families. You could argue, yes, you can use pay-as-you-go, but if you're using a bank card and you're, a mum travelling with 4 kids or a dad travelling with 4 kids, you don't necessarily have enough bank cards to be able to pay for everyone that way. And then similarly, if you're not from London, you might not have an Oyster card that they can use, and it can be a bit of a lengthy process. So if you're just coming up for the day, that's not necessarily an option for you. So again, this is where things like the day travel card, that again can also help with those integrated journeys, multimodal journeys, can be really beneficial, and not having that is likely to have an impact on some of the people who again can least afford it. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Yes, so we have also been in contact with TfL, and we've sent them quite a lot of evidence from our members in our community, and we will be responding to the consultation as well. We would very strongly encourage that the day travel card remains in place for a lot of the reasons that Alex has already mentioned, but in general, travel cards are easier and simpler for a lot of people to use. Wheelchair users, for example, you can show a staff member at the barrier on underground or at train stations, which is another reason that ticket offices are so important, because there is then a visible staff member there who can come and assist you. Without that, if you are having to use pay-as-you-go or tapping an Oyster, you have to get very, very close to the reader, like uncomfortably so. There might not be that ability to touch on the reader and then back out and come through the barrier in the time frame that it allows. For people who aren't Londoners, as you've mentioned, it is the cheaper option because you can combine your disabled person's rail card when you buy the day travel card. You can, of course, do that with an Oyster card as well, but again, as Alex has mentioned, if you're not from London and you're having to buy an Oyster card, that does rack up a price as well, especially now that the scheme, I think there used to be a scheme where you could return your Oyster card to a ticket office and get your deposit back. You can't do that anymore. If you lose your Oyster card, that's then another deposit and another deposit for what might potentially be quite infrequent journeys to London, so you are racking up quite a lot of expense there. We've also heard from people that they end up being penalised for taking too long on their journeys because they're hitting the maximum journey time, because their journeys take longer if they don't receive assistance on time. You know, the manual ramp isn't put down in time, they're missing their trains, or, you know, just taking longer to navigate interchanges due to moving more slowly as a result of impairment, or just kind of having to wait for that assistance. And I think you are only able to claim the maximum travel time refund 3 times in a month for disabled Londoners who are travelling and then hitting that unfairly more than 3 times in a month. That's a very large financial impact. We have also heard from some learning disabled people who use cash, that they have to use cash. It is much more accessible to them to know exactly what amount they're spending on the travel card. They can go to a staff member at a ticket office, say, I want the day travel card, here is the money that you need to give me that travel card, and then it's one thing, it's there, it's not something that you're having to constantly think about. And then also the kind of tap-out infrastructure is really confusing and inaccessible for some people. They're not always visible. The colour contrast of the kind of tap-out readers where there's no barriers is often essentially the same as the surrounding infrastructure. It's grey. It's not very easy to see. At Canning Town, for example, in Royal Victoria, I had that issue today. So there's, I will stop now, but there are many reasons why we would encourage the maintenance of the day travel card.
Fabulous. I have one final question, if that's all right, to put to Sab. So, looking at the analysis that London TravelWatch did for us, looking at the London Travel Demand Survey, 28.6% of journeys overall are for leisure purposes. And another thing that we did once in London for the Olympic Games, and I would like to see more of, is when you had a ticket for the Olympics, you were also given a paper day travel card. That was the method by which we were able to provide that sort of combi ticket, which is a European concept. We need to be working with more venues to enable people to get travel alongside their tickets. And how are you looking at how we're going to do that if day travel cards no longer exist?
Yeah, I think that's a fair challenge. I think there's a number of different operators and providers and venues that we could certainly work with to look at the options that are available. I listened to the comments and appreciate the concerns that everybody's raised. There's a number of issues, by the way, particularly on the Oyster card deposit, which is part of the same problem, which is that the government has required us to come up with new revenue sources in order to comply with the funding deal. And of course the day travel card would predominantly affect those travelling from outside London, though we've heard some good examples of how it would affect some travellers within London as well. One of the things we've done is write back to the Secretary of State who expressed his opposition, having also required TfL to produce more revenue, to work creatively on a solution to this. So that's what the Mayor has done. I had again in the same meeting I had with the Rail Minister, raised this issue as well, and he has also committed to see what government can do creatively. So in addition to talking to venues about potential options, we're also talking to government about potential ways of avoiding a problem that frankly has arisen from government.
Have you looked at potentially installing barcode readers as well as tap readers? I know that's a different technology that the rail companies use, but that does potentially offer then a solution for having a piece of paper and a barcode.
Sure, there's different technologies, and I would have to defer to colleagues at TfL who are far more well versed in the benefits and disbenefits of different reader technologies. But one point I would make is, Madeline, your note about the difficulty that some people face with the accessibility of the readers and so on is very well taken. One thing that we've concentrated a lot on is step-free access, and rightly so, and I'm proud of the work that we've done to improve the network, and there's certainly a lot further to go. But other areas that I know the Commissioner is very committed to, and the Mayor has expressed his desire that he be committed to, is to ensure that we remove other forms of barriers to travel which aren't necessarily related to the physical infrastructure but to the ways in which particularly neurodiverse people access the network. So we'll take your points very much on board.
Okay. Let me just clarify where we're going to move with the meeting, because we've got so much still to get through and we have to be out of here by 1. So what I'm going to suggest is the final section we had on active travel. We may be right to guess to get more detail on that. So we drop that section completely. Buses, if members can just be pacey with their questions. I know Labour, I've got both Ummesh and Ellie, so if you want to prioritise the ones we can always put in writing, because we're going to have a second meeting, I'm assuming it'll be September, where I'm hoping to get the train companies in, or the chair will get the train companies in. We could always pick up some other things there if we want more stuff on buses. Potentially we get someone else in on buses then. Okay. I had wanted to segue between heavy rail and buses with light rail trams, really important for boroughs like Sutton. Very briefly, in a couple of sentences, Geoff, where do trams fit in getting modal shift in outer London, giving that choice? And where are we with securing things like the Sutton tram extension, which I think is probably very important for Sutton and other boroughs?
So our number one priority at the moment is to renew the kit on the existing tram network, because trams are getting quite old now, approaching 25 years old, which is their life extent. So they begin to get increasingly unreliable. Extensions aren't funded, they're not in the business plan at the moment, I'm sorry to say, to that network. The trams do good things, but they also come with significant cost, and it's we talked earlier about the need for capital support from government. It's not at the top of the list of things that we would put up there. We mentioned DLR to Thamesmead or West London Orbital or Piccadilly Line signalling and things of that nature, which will come before it, I'm afraid, and in the long list of things that we would like to upgrade and enhance.
Okay. We haven't got time to get into detail on tram, whether we might flag that for next time as well. Let's move on to buses. Assembly Member Boff.
So I'm going to ask a closed question, and that is, Mr. Dance, has TfL undertaken a comprehensive review of bus service needs in outer London?
I believe the answer is yes.
Yes.
And the person next to me is.
Yeah, I don't want any more than that. That's confirmed. We have done a review. Can I now ask Councillor Lewis, were you involved in the development of that, or was Sutton involved in the development of that review?
I'm recently appointed to this post, so I can't give you a clear answer, I'm afraid. I would hope we were, and I quite trust Geoff to confirm that. So,
Mr. Stubbings, were you involved in that review of outer London bus routes, bus service needs?
Again, I wouldn't be able to answer directly on that. What I can tell you, though, is that we have recently started in-depth discussions with TfL on a review of buses within Havering. Whether we were involved in that particular review, I don't know.
But it wasn't such a significant thing that you remembered it up front. So, Mr. Hobbs, could you tell me what involvement boroughs had in the development in that comprehensive review?
So we did. With regard to Sutton, we worked with Sutton officers and indeed members, and I've been down to the Public Transport Liaison Committee, and there is a large review, the consultation for which we've undertaken, and there's a large number of changes occurring on the 2nd of March. With regard to Havering, there's all sorts of, got the names of the relevant officers here, which exchanged with Neil earlier, and there is also, out of that, a particular consultation that is extant at the moment, and there are other conversations to change the bus network in the way that Neil described earlier to address particular priorities such as Beam Park and some of the areas at the south of the borough.
Councillor Lewis.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. And I'd just like to take slight issue with Geoff's comment about a large number of changes. There are going to be some changes coming in on the 1st of March, and unfortunately it's a bit like the 213 bus and the 127. You giveth with one hand, but you taketh away with the other. We have been working well with TfL, and Geoff and the rest of his team have worked well with us, and we are talking about what we can do with Sutton buses, but there's a lot more that we can do. There's a lot more that we need to do.
Thank you. Do you want to reply to that? Bearing in mind the time?
Yes, only to say that there's always give and take, but we are giving 400 kilometres more, 400,000 kilometres more than we're taking on this particular occasion.
Thanks very much. Back in November, the London Borough of Hillingdon asked that you put into place an express bus route so that the residents of Uxbridge might be able to avail themselves of the improvements as a result of the Elizabeth line. And that express bus route, we haven't heard whether or not that's going to be included yet. Are you going to commit to an express bus route from Uxbridge down to West Drayton and Hayes and Harlington?
So we introduced a limited stop express bus service in 2019 called the X140. And that will form part of the Superloop route. We also introduced then the 278, not an express one but an ordinary one. There is already an express bus route, the A10, which goes between Uxbridge Town Centre and Heathrow, and we're working on a scheme with Uxbridge officers to provide more through routes north, south and Hillingdon through Uxbridge down towards the Elizabeth line and Heathrow.
Gosh, it's amazing the activity you get when there's a by-election on.
I know, there's a fascination with Uxbridge
we've already got a police station out of it, and now we're going to get buses out of it. So we'll seize the opportunity. 3 years. Perhaps, yeah. Let's keep open the swimming pool while we're here. Absolutely. Can we? Could you write to me in detail about what those plans are, and preferably before next Thursday? Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, I'll now move on to another question. What's been the impact on residents of cuts to bus services in Outer London? I'd like to ask Alex Smith that.
Thank you. So I will start just by talking a little bit about who uses the bus most, because that will, I think, illuminate
okay.
kind of the impact.
Don't give us a said dance treatise. What we want is a nice, concise response.
Yeah. So they are most used by lower income Londoners, disabled people, given again they are one of the more accessible forms. Ethnic minorities and women, so they are a very important thing, and they also serve areas that aren't necessarily served by other modes, so they are important. In terms of, I think there obviously have been some cuts, there have been some increases as well, so I think it would very much depend on the area, but also looking at the reductions in terms of the bus route might be maintained, but if the frequency is lower, I guess our concern would be where that ceases to be sort of seen as a turn up and go service, and again, does that kind of discourage people from using the bus or just travelling at all? But again, I think I would look at the impact on specific areas, because I know some areas have seen improvements, some areas have seen a worsening in services, so I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
Thank you. And sorry, shall I hand it over to you?
No.
Yeah, okay. Apologies for that. And could I say, Ms. Stewart, what's been the effect on your clientele?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. So I think I did speak at length earlier about the frequency of buses, given that disabled people do rely on buses as the most accessible form of public transport. I think one of the issues with bus cuts is that often those are kind of justified by slight amendments to other routes, and therefore kind of more bus interchanges. So you're still technically on one bus journey, but you're making an interchange at another stop. Often those stops don't have accessible infrastructure, they don't have shelters, they don't have lighting, they don't have a tactile paving, or the pavement is bumpy. So yes, just kind of all those similar things. It does discourage bus use, and it does often put disabled people's health and safety at risk.
Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you.
I'm going to ask 17. I think it's been...
No. Assembly Member Prince is going to ask a question now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, and sorry about the confusion there. So what I'd like to ask about actually is the Superloop. We have our own name for that, but won't go into that. So could I ask Madeline, first of all, what do you think the Superloop will do for the people you represent?
Thank you. Yes. Well, we are always in support of more buses. More buses is always a good thing. I think it will kind of depend on the eventual outcome of the routes. Obviously, there are existing routes in place that will form part of the Superloop network. It's great to see that they are connecting town centres. We would hope, and I think this was part of the initial proposals, if I'm remembering correctly, but that some of those networks will connect more health centres and hospitals and make it easier to make those journeys without potentially having to use a car, for example. So, yes.
Can I ask you, please?
Yep. So, I mean, I agree that, we're happy, any bus, extra bus is an extra bus, and that is beneficial to people. And London TravelWatch have long been calling for orbital routes. Lots of modes kind of focus on radial going into central London, but we know lots of people don't travel that way. People will travel around outer boroughs. So from that perspective, we think it can be very beneficial, as Maddie mentioned, linking up different areas, but would say that it is a good start, but that's what we see it as, a start. It's, there are lots of areas that this won't necessarily benefit. It doesn't go into every borough. So we would like to kind of see this as a stepping stone to introducing more routes. Again, some of the routes are kind of pre-existing routes. So again, the extra kilometres is very welcome, but I think we'd like to see more. And then also alongside that, if it's to work, we'd like to see this accompanied by bus priority measures. An express bus is great, but if it's stuck in traffic, it's just a bus stuck in traffic. So things like more bus lanes, looking at other measures, timing traffic lights, for example, things like that. I think we would like to see that accompany this, so that people who do need this type of transport can really benefit from the impacts.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Councillor Lewis, your views on that?
Basically, we welcome it. I mean, it's good news. There are a couple of comments to make about it. It hasn't happened yet. It's still jammed tomorrow, but we look forward to it. We do look forward to it coming in. Echo the comments about it's an express bus, but how do we make sure it doesn't get stuck in traffic? And we have the same problem as Havering. We've got narrow streets. It's very difficult putting bus lanes down the roads. So what do we do? It is a challenge. We'll flag up another, because I don't want to be seen as being too critical of TfL, just linked in with that perhaps, but the various bus apps that you can now get that tell you how to connect your journeys up. And I went to Kingston the other day by public transport, and it told me, bus to Kingston, X26, bus to Sutton, X26 down to Kingston. And it was great, and it worked. It got me there really quickly. Broadly, we welcome orbital travel, because that's the problem we have in Sutton and outer London boroughs. It's getting round. So thank you.
Neil, I saved the best till last.
I can't really say very much about the Superloop in Havering, because all the benefits it's going to bring, we won't be getting them because we're not included in it. And I think even our colleagues in Barking and Dagenham had to fight for an extra bit as well. When it was originally announced, it didn't include Barking and Dagenham, so East London wasn't faring very well when it came to the Superloop.
Would you like to see any additional route? Can you suggest anything?
Within Havering, we have a desperate need for a north-south link within the borough, which would be part of the radial link, because within Havering where it sits, north-south would be radial. As I said earlier on, if you want to go from Rainham to Harold Hill in the borough, it takes about an hour and a half, 3 buses, and you have to leave the borough. It is quite incredible. We have strategic industrial land down in Rainham within the Thames Freeport, has no buses whatsoever. You just can't get down there, a PTAL of 0. So we desperately need that additional link, and we'd love to be part of some other extension of the Superloop and more other buses, but we are looking to see if we can fund some form of tram link with some of additional development in the borough and growth.
I suppose it'd be unkind, Geoff, not to let you come in, but can you make it very brief, please?
Yes. So just to note that 90% of London residents will be within a stop or a station with which they can make one interchange with the Superloop. There are, just to correct it, there are 6, I can give you the route numbers, 6 north-south routes in Havering, and we're consulting on a 7th. The Superloop we're doubling the frequency on the X26 in the fairly near future that goes through Sutton, and there are other operating enhancements on the 607, currently named 607 as well. And it is quite the biggest intervention that I can think of in many, many years in terms of the volume of bus service.
Well, I would just like to put on record thanks to you and Seb for meeting me yesterday to talk about trying to get a linking service in the north of the borough, in Havering. Thank you.
Lovely. Right, I've got Assemblymember Desai, then it's going to be Assemblymember Garrett who's got a quick question. If we have time, because we've got 10 minutes left, Assemblymember Baker. If not, Geoff, I'm hoping you might be able to come back to our next meeting, which will be in September, because we're going to get the TOCs in, but also to look at buses because of your encyclopedic knowledge on it. Assemblymember Desai.
Chair, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll come straight to the point. 2 questions, if I could fit them in. One's about the Superloops, and the other is about the Bus 86. So my question is to you, Geoff. It's about Barking Dagenham. On the 29th of March, a mayoral spokesperson said, quote, Havering and Barking and Dagenham residents will be able to travel by bus and connect with the services on the Superloop using the hopper fare, unquote. So they would not have a stop. But on the 23rd of May, the mayor said at MQT, Transport for London's initial plans are that Barking Dagenham will host Superloop stops. There seems to be some confusion here. Can you just clear up this confusion and let the residents of Barking and Dagenham know, will they have Superloop stops or not? How many stops, if so, and where are they going to be located?
Yes, there will. It will go to Barking Town Centre, amongst others. It will go to Ilford. It will go down to... Do you want me to tell you the route?
No, I know the route, but it goes along the outskirts of Barking. Actually, when I talk about Barking Dagenham, it's a big borough. I'm talking about road goes inside Barking into Dagenham. So connecting into Havering.
90% of residents will be one interchange of a Superloop route, including the proposed X123, which goes from Walthamstow to North Woolwich through parts of Barking and Dagenham Borough.
The outskirts of Barking.
It's still through the town centres of both Ilford and Barking.
I know, I've seen your press release.
So, and it interchanges with Ilford, with the Elizabeth line, with the District line and many others at Barking, and with numerous other buses elsewhere.
I'm not going to push this point further. I will just say that does not serve Barking Dagenham at all. It's on the outskirts of the borough. My second question, because of the time, Chair, is, Geoff, you wrote a constituent of mine recently about the 86 bus extension, well, not constituent, Chadwell Heath Residents Association, who submitted a 800-strong petition about extending the 86 bus to Queen's Hospital. You said that TF are not going to extend the bus due to the cost and capacity of the hospital. Instead, patients would need to change in Romford Town Centre. These residents are worried about their personal safety waiting for a bus late at night. What can TfL do to ensure that they feel safe? We had transport plenary last week, where I asked questions about crime on the transport network. Crime, we were told by the BBC 2 days ago, has risen by 40% compared to pre-pandemic level. Of course, ridership has gone up as well. So one of the things I did stress, that we look about bus extensions, bus routes, we should be looking at crime, security, safety, particularly at busy stops like Romford. Busy interchanges, hubs.
On the 86, the real problem is that there's just no more space at Queen's Hospital for additional services, even if we could afford it. So there's a real constraint there. In terms of safety and security, there is, I could take you through, if we had more time, a whole bus security programme, which is looking at how we work with the Met Police, what we're doing around signage for emergency, how we work with Project Guardian, victim confidence, even lower level things like fare evasion, and that sets out how we would approach it in general and by extension specifically at Ilford Town Centre.
I do know that 1 in 25, according to the BBC report 2 days ago, evade fares, and I actually applaud TfL's work around security and safety. I'll give you credit for that as being on the police and crime committee. So it's not all about talking to TfL. There's a hell of a lot of good work, especially safety of women and so on. But I must say that I will come back to you about the 86, but I think there are ways that John Credis myself have identified that we could address this particular issue.
Lovely.
And I think we should not just look at sort of balance sheets, to quote Neil Stubbing's spreadsheets. When you were talking earlier about...
It's not so much a spreadsheet as a site visit to the hospital looking for places where one can stand the bus.
Lovely. All right, then we can pick that up outside. That feels like casework to me. Assemblymember Garrett.
Yes, very quickly. So the X26, lovely. Express is one of the bits of Superloop that exists and exists in my constituency, which is lovely. We had a meeting, some of us in this room were at, in 2021, where there was about a safety issue in the middle of Carshalton, which is part of the X26 route, and there was an X26 bus route review happening at that time, and I was trying to tag on in particular some safety and issues in Carshalton to that. That was back in 2021. When the Superloop was announced, I thought, brilliant, that means this is all going to happen. So I put in a question immediately saying, what's happening with the X26 bus route review? And got the answer back, nothing is happening with the X26 bus route review. So, Geoff, what is happening with the X26 bus route review? And in particular, the bit in the middle of Carshalton, which I know is dear to Councillor Lewis's heart as well. It's a bit of the TfL road network where you can't even have two buses passing each other. It's very narrow. It's not brilliant.
So I would have to remind myself as to the nature of that review and who's dealing with it back at the ranch, but we're not proposing to alter the route of the X26.
Sorry, it was not a review of the route as a route, it was a looking at the route. What can we do to improve the situation along the route? For example, safety, bus speeds, etc.
So what we are doing, in terms of bus priority, the team is looking at how we can look at bus lanes. We are reviewing cycles on traffic signals, looking at what other ways and means we can get buses moving faster, because it's good for everybody. It gets usage up and it reduces costs. So we would dearly love all that kind of stuff. About the individual single lane bit, I don't know the answer to that. But
let's get something in writing
about
on
that. That would be very useful. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you.
Get something in writing. Ellie, you've got 2 minutes.
I don't think I'm going to even try, Chair, because my questions are all about like bus demands and interaction about bus speeds and stuff like that, and I don't think it would be fair to ask Geoff to answer all that in 3 minutes.
Well,
so I'd really appreciate the opportunity to put it in writing, and you know what we can do, basically drive up bus use in outer London.
Well, let's look at trying to do a letter in that we get a response before our next committee. Marina is waving at me. You weren't on my list, Marina. Is it literally
It's very
30
quick
seconds?
and very relevant about the new bus trams. So you will be aware, of course, that we've had a welcome announcement for the new bus tram for the 358 route from Crystal Palace to Orpington. What plans are there to extend this type of vehicle, particularly in places like Bromley, where there is a need for this kind of transport?
So this is a bit of a peculiar route because it's exceptionally long. So we've got this unusual bus which recharges itself with a pantograph at either end, because if we didn't do that, it will run out of charge too quickly. So it's a bit of a special case, and therefore it's a trial, and we'll see how it goes. There is another example on 132 which is slightly different, but most bus routes are rather shorter, and we'll be using more standard battery zero emission electric buses instead. But we're at roundly 1,000 buses in our contracted fleet now, which are zero emission, and that will be going up to the whole fleet in due course of 8,700.
That's great news. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, after that discussion, I would like to thank London TravelWatch for your fantastic submission and detailed report and analysis for our meeting today. I'd like to thank our guests, so Neil, Barry, Geoff, Seb, Alex, Josh and Madeleine. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we've had to sort of rush you a bit today. If there are things you wanted to say that you haven't been able to, please put them in writing to us. We're having a second hearing. I think it will be our September meeting. we have got a few more items of business to deal with, so in the meantime, please feel free to leave the chamber. And thank you very much indeed. So, committee, can I ask us to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate? I've got two delegations here. Authority to me as Deputy Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this meeting. And can we delegate authority to me as Deputy Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree a letter from the committee in response to the consultation on the proposed closure of ticket offices? Agreed. Lovely. Item 5, our work...
On that Chair, the delegation, would that be circulated to all members of the committee in advance of it being sent, or just...
It would just normally be the group leads, but if you've got a specific...
It's such a current situation.
Yeah, well, if you've got specific, then we can copy in the rest of the committee, but it will be the group leads who would sign off. Absolutely. Lovely. Okay, let's do that. Our work programme, can we note the work programme?
Yep.
Lovely, thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 5th of September at 10 o'clock in the chamber at City Hall. I've got no other urgent business, so I conclude the meeting. Thank you very much, members. 1 o'clock on the dot.